Something is wrong in the photograph. The light feels too still, too perfect. The child's eyes open, glassy or hollow, yet someone has carefully placed a delicate flower in her hand. You can almost hear the whisper of the shutter closing, locking that frozen moment in time, as if trying to convince the world she is still alive. In Victorian England, death came often, quietly, and far too soon. But what followed was far stranger: grieving parents paying photographers to pose their dead children like sleeping angels, upright in chairs, even smiling. The result is haunting, eerie, beautiful, and deeply unsettling, a desperate attempt to deny the cold, creeping reality that the house had gone silent. Each photograph holds a story, but also a warning. The illusion of life clings to pale faces, frozen expressions, and empty eyes. It's a reminder that death doesn't end quietly. Sometimes it lingers, captured forever in the lens. Once you see these images, you'll feel the weight of the Victorian sorrow and the creeping unease of life imitating death. And remember, the next time you glance at an old photograph, look closely, because sometimes the dead are not as still as they seem. This is not just a story about mourning. It's about the illusion of life clinging to the face of death. And once you see these photographs, you'll understand why the Victorians could never truly let go. The room smells faintly of lavender water and ether. A single candle burns near the edge of a draped table, its light unsteady against the glass panes of a tall window. Outside, London exhales a slow fog, the kind that settles on the rooftops and refuses to move. Inside, time has stopped. The photographer lifts his head from behind the black cloth and stares at the image slowly blooming on the plate, heart thudding against his ribs. The little girl in the picture is sitting upright, her curls brushed, her lips faintly pink, her eyes, God help him, seem open. He wipes his palms on his waistcoat. He knows she was dead when they brought her in. The mother's face had told him before her trembling mouth could say a word. Yet here, on the glass, she looks awake. The air around the plate feels wrong, as if it has learned to breathe. A droplet of sweat slides down his temple. He doesn't call for anyone. He only watches as the faint chemical mist curls and twists around the girl's faint smile, like breath on a cold morning. Behind him, the mother stands in silence, clutching a handkerchief until her knuckles turn white. She dares not look at the plate. She has already seen too much. Her child, laid out that morning upon a bed of lace, was warm only in memory. The photographer had lifted her head gently, propped her against the chair, and whispered apologies under his breath as he adjusted her arms. It had taken an hour before the limbs would bend just right. Now, as the image sets, the mother closes her eyes. Somewhere beneath the candle's flicker, she swears she hears her daughter's shallow inhale. He tells himself it is the draft, that all sounds are tricks of grief and shutter. Yet something in the silence feels alive, the faint creak of floorboards, the way the curtain breathes in and out as if the walls themselves mourn. When the image finishes drying, he holds it up for her to see. The mother gasps, hand trembling toward the glass. She's smiling, she whispers. The photographer nods, though he knows he didn't see that smile before. It came after. Outside, a carriage rattles past, shaking dust from the rafters. The fog seeps through the door cracks, bringing the smell of coal and iron into the studio. He lowers the plate into its case, careful not to smudge the face that now seems to follow him with its eyes. It is not the first dead child he has photographed, and it will not be the last, but something in this one feels different. Perhaps it is the warmth of her expression, or the prophet's faint blush on her cheeks, or perhaps, he thinks, it is because he has begun to forget where the line between life and remembrance truly lies. By the time the mother leaves, clutching the sealed photograph to her chest like a living thing, the candle has guttered low. The photographer sits back in the chair where the girl once was, watching the shadows crawl across the wall. He tells himself the room is empty now, but as the last light fades, he could swear he hears a child's breath behind him, soft, patient, and waiting for another photograph. The morning light slid through the lace curtains like pale smoke. It touched the white sheet laid over the small form on the table, tracing her outline without mercy. Her mother had not slept. The chair beside the child's bed was worn smooth by her hand, and every creak of the floor felt like a betrayal of the silence they had kept through the night. Outside, a lamplighter was extinguishing the last gas flame on the street, his pole clinking softly against the glass. The day had begun, but for the family inside, time had ended. The photographer arrived just past 7, his hat pressed tight against his chest. He was not the first visitor to call upon death that week. The undertaker had come earlier to measure, the doctor to confirm, the priest to pray. But the photographer was different. He had no words of comfort, no scripture, no condolences. He had come only to preserve what could not be kept. He moved through the house quietly, his boots making soft indentations in the hallway carpet, as if he feared to disturb the ghost already waiting. The child had been dressed in her Sunday gown, lace collar neatly pinned, ribbons smoothed over her shoulders. Someone had placed her favorite doll beside her, its porcelain face cracked from years of play. The photographer unpacked his instruments without looking at the mother. He had learned long ago that her silence was not to be filled. The camera's tripod clicked open with a sound that seemed too loud for the room. Dust rose in thin spirals through the sunlight. "Hold her as if she were sleeping," he said at last, his voice low, rehearsed, almost gentle. The mother obeyed. She gathered her daughter's limp body, felt the cold weight settle in her arms, and tried to remember the warmth that had once been there. When the photographer adjusted the stand behind them, an iron frame designed to keep the dead upright, she felt a tremor in her knees but did not move. The air in the parlor thickened as the man ducked beneath his dark cloth. "Keep still," he murmured, a few seconds only. The shutter opened with a faint metallic gasp. For that moment, even the house seemed to hold its breath. The mother's eyes filled but did not fall. She would not ruin the image. When the shutter closed again, the photographer exhaled as though surfacing from deep water. He stepped forward, checked the glass plate, and nodded. "She'll look peaceful," he said. The mother did not answer. She stared at her child's face, the eyes open, unseeing. The pupils reflected the faint glint of window-light, making her appear alive for the briefest instant. The photographer hesitated. "Shall I?" he began, gesturing toward the eyes. The mother shook her head. "No," she whispered. "Let her look at me one last time." When it was done, he packed his equipment and backed out of the room. The mother remained, rocking gently with the child in her lap, whispering lullabies to a silence that would never answer. Outside, the morning fog began to lift, carrying the sound of the camera's click through the open window like a departing soul. The neighbors would say later that they saw her still there by dusk, unmoving, cradling what the city had already forgotten. The child did not blink, and in the photograph that would follow, she never would. The air itself seemed to bruise the lungs. London in the middle of the 19th century was a living thing, a heaving, coughing city of chimneys and soot. Coal dust settled over rooftops like black snow, coating every sill and cradle in the same fine ash. Children learned early that the sky was not blue but grey, and that coughs came as easily as laughter. Inside the narrow terraces, mothers pressed damp cloths to their infants' faces, whispering prayers through the steam of boiled vinegar. Disease was not an intruder here, it was a tenant. In the poorer quarters, families lived 10 to a room, their breaths mingling in the damp. The walls sweated with mildew, the floors sagged with rot, and the drains outside belched an odor that clung to the hair. Each winter brought a new wave of sorrow: cholera, scarlet fever, diphtheria, typhus. The children were always the first to fall. One day they were chasing hoops through the street, cheeks bright with frost. The next, their voices were gone, replaced by the wheeze of a bellows breath. And so the black crepe was hung over door frames again and again and again. The wealthy were not spared, only hidden behind cleaner curtains. In the tall houses of Bloomsbury and Kensington, death came quieter. muffled by thick carpets and silver teaspoons. Doctors spoke softly, their diagnoses heavy with Latin and finality. Even those who could afford medicine understood how little it mattered. The same air filled every lung, the same soot lined every child's throat. A fever could turn to delirium before the clock struck midnight. When the body cooled by dawn, servants fetched the photographer. He was as common to the household as the undertaker. They arrived in silence, carrying their black boxes like coffins of their own. In a world that lost so many so quickly, memory had become a luxury worth paying for, and in this age of soot and sickness, the photograph was the closest thing to resurrection. Factories churned without rest, filling the city with an industrial heartbeat that drowned the sound of mourning. Children worked the same machines that killed their fathers, fingers sliced or lungs shredded by cotton dust. Death was no longer sacred, it was statistical. Each obituary, a line item in the newspapers, each photograph a small rebellion against oblivion. The Victorians had learned to live beside loss, to dine beside it, to tuck it neatly beneath lace and prayer. As the century turned, death was no longer the enemy, it was the inevitable neighbour who knocked politely at the door. The mothers of London began to prepare early, buying black ribbon before their children had even fallen ill. The photographers knew the streets well. They could tell which houses would summon them next. On nights when the smog pressed too thick to see the stars, a strange stillness hung over the city. Somewhere, a mother whispered a name to an empty cradle. Somewhere else, a flash of magnesium light caught the curve of a child's cheek one last time. And through the haze, the streets breathed grief, like steam, soft, ceaseless, and human. The body was never sent away. Not yet. In the Victorian home, death did not depart quickly. It lingered, polite and heavy, like a guest who refused to rise from their chair. The parlor, that proud room of family display and afternoon tea, became its stage. Curtains were drawn to dim the light. Mirrors were veiled in black crepe, so that the soul, confused and wandering, would not trap itself in glass. The clock on the mantelpiece was stopped at the hour of passing, marking the exact moment time had turned against them. Neighbors came quietly. They were ushered in through the back door, their voices low, their gloves dark. In the middle of the room stood the child's body, laid upon a table or small bed draped in white linen. Around her were arranged flowers, lilies for purity, violets for faithfulness, rosemary for remembrance. Candles flickered beside her head, their smoke curling upward like prayers that would not reach heaven. The air smelled of wax and fading perfume, and beneath it all, the faint iron tang of stillness. Victorian families believed death should not be hidden. It was a moral act to face it, to prepare the body, to see it one last time, to weep without shame. Mothers washed their children themselves, pressing cool water over cooling skin. Fathers carried the coffin out when the time came, shoulders trembling beneath its weight. To grieve in public was considered unseemly, but within the home, sorrow was ritual. The parlor became a chapel, a place where love and death met and refused to part. Photographers often arrived before the undertaker. Their equipment was heavy, their expressions practiced, as if each death had dulled them 1 degree further from feeling. They moved furniture to catch the right light, opening curtains just enough to reveal a glint of daylight on the child's hair. Sometimes they placed the mother in the frame, holding the child upright as though asleep against her chest. Other times, they photographed the body alone, surrounded by favorite toys or flowers, a final portrait of false peace. The first exposure always felt like an intrusion, the click of the shutter, an audible trespass into something sacred. Yet the families welcomed it, almost eagerly. For them, it was a small defiance against decay. They had watched too many faces vanish too soon, too utterly. A photograph was permanence, a promise that memory would not yield so easily to dust. When the photographer left, he bowed at the doorway, hat in hand, as though departing from a church. The house would return to its stillness. The family would linger, afraid to remove the candles or uncover the mirrors. unwilling to break the fragile balance between the living and the dead. By nightfall, the parlor would smell entirely of roses and smoke. Outside, carriages passed, and the city carried on with its noise and soot. Inside, the family sat together in silence, waiting for the dawn to come, and with it, the undertaker's knock. The child would leave the house the next day, but her photograph would stay behind, staring gently from the mantel for years to come, as if death had chosen to remain in the parlor forever. He arrived with a box that could hold eternity. To the grieving, he seemed less like a tradesman and more like a conjurer, a man who could capture what heaven had taken. His name was seldom remembered, for there were hundreds like him, traveling from street to street with tripods strapped to their backs and bottles of collodion clinking softly in their satchels. But to the mothers who opened their doors with red eyes and trembling hands, he was a savior of sorts, a man who sold the impossible, a second chance to see their child breathe. He spoke little, as most of his kind did. Words cheapened the moment, and grief did not need language. He unpacked his equipment in silence, arranging glass plates and brass lenses with the care of a surgeon. Each object gleamed faintly in the dim parlor light, touched by candle flame and the smell of lilacs wilting beside the body. When he moved, the boards creaked beneath his boots like whispers from another room. These photographers had learned long ago that time moved differently for the bereaved. A minute could stretch into an hour, a glance could carry the weight of a lifetime. They adjusted their work to that rhythm, slow, deliberate, reverent. The exposure took seconds, but the preparation could take hours. The body had to be positioned as though merely asleep, the limbs bent naturally, the eyes sometimes painted open with a careful stroke of pigment. Every detail mattered. To make the dead seem alive required not only skill, but faith that the illusion itself could soothe the wound. He charged little. Often, he accepted payment in keepsakes, a brooch, a locket, a father's watch. For many families, his work cost less than a coffin. He did not mind. He understood that memory was worth more than coin. Some said he had photographed hundreds, others thousands. He kept no ledger, no record of names. His clients came to him for eternity, not documentation. At night, when the day's chemicals had been washed from his hands, he sometimes dreamt of the faces he had captured. They drifted before him in shades of silver, and shadow children with half smiles, mothers staring too intently, fathers blurred at the edges. He told himself they were only images, that nothing of the soul lingered in the glass. Yet, when he developed the plates, he sometimes felt the air around him shift, as if someone were standing just beyond the lamplight, waiting to be seen again. In the early years he was mocked by the living. Morbid trade, they called it, profiting from grief. But soon even the critics found themselves calling when the cough took their own. By the 1860s, every town had at least one such studio, each draped in velvet curtains, each with a scent of ether and roses that could not be scrubbed away. He died quietly in his sleep one winter evening, the last plate he developed still resting in a basin by his bed. It was the image of a small boy, propped against a chair, one hand raised as if waving goodbye. When they found the photographer's body, the plate had dried perfectly. The boy's eyes caught the light just so, giving the impression that he, not the photographer, was the one still alive. And so the man who sold immortality found himself outlasted by his own creation, his ghost forever trapped in the trade that promised to keep death still. By the 1850s, grief had become not only an emotion but a performance, one rehearsed in front of mirrors, printed in magazines, and stitched into every thread of mourning dress. In the great drawing rooms of London and Manchester, sorrow was no longer simply felt, it was displayed. The black veil, the jet jewelry, the long procession of carriages, all these spoke a language everyone understood. Death was a social event, and mourning had become its own kind of theatre. Queen Victoria set the tone. When Prince Albert died in 1861, the monarch turned her private heartbreak into national ritual. She withdrew from society, ordered all servants to wear black, and decreed that even court invitations should be bordered in mourning ink. What began as a widow's despair became a doctrine of respectability. Across Britain, women followed suit, turning grief into an art form, and in doing so, they gave birth to an entire industry. Shop windows filled with mourning goods, black parasols, bombazine gowns, crepe bonnets, gloves dyed to match sorrow's hue. Tailors, jewelers, and perfumers thrived on despair. Whole streets became devoted to loss funeral outfitters beside photographers, mourning clothiers beside florists who specialized only in lilies and wreaths. Death had become fashionable, and fashion, in turn, dictated how long love must ache. There were rules to follow, and the Victorians obeyed them meticulously. A widow must remain in deep mourning for at least 2 years, wearing only matte black. A child's death required 1 year of half-mourning grey, mauve, or lavender accents, signaling that life was beginning to creep cautiously back in. Even jewelry spoke of the dead, brooches containing woven locks of hair, lockets with miniature portraits painted from posthumous photographs, rings engraved with initials and dates of passing. To dress in mourning was to declare one's virtue, to show the world that your love had been pure, enough to leave you undone. Yet beneath the rules and the ribbons lay something darker, a quiet competition of sorrow. In parlors and tea circles, women whispered about the sincerity of each other's grief. Was her veil too thin? Had she abandoned black too soon? Mourning became a mirror of morality, a performance of devotion that could not be faked without consequence. Photographers benefited most of all. Their studios became the new cathedrals of grief, where the bereaved could both mourn and preserve. The newly widowed brought portraits of their late husbands to be retouched, softened, brightened, transformed into idealized angels. Mothers carried the small bodies of their children through side doors to avoid the stares of passers-by. Each photograph was framed not just as remembrance, but as proof of propriety, a statement that their love had conformed to society's rules of grief. Even the children understood the ritual. They watched their mothers draped in black, their homes dimmed, the laughter rationed for respectability's sake. Grief was a costume they, too, would someday wear. And so the photographs multiplied, as though each silver plate could fill the empty space left behind by a life cut short. By the end of the century, mourning had become its own economy, an empire built upon absence. Beneath every hat and veil lay the same truth the Victorians could not name, that no amount of fashion, etiquette, or formality could soften the sound of a child's empty room. But in their sorrow, they discovered something enduring, that beauty could live beside death, and that even the deepest grief could be dressed in elegance. The door closed with a soft thud, sealing out the city's noise. Inside, the studio felt like another world, part chapel, part laboratory, half shadow, half dream. A heavy velvet curtain muffled the street beyond. The air smelled of collodion and smoke, of drying flowers and chemical ghosts. On the far side of the room stood the camera, its great brass eyes staring unblinking at the space where the body would soon be placed. It was not an ordinary studio. Here, conversation was forbidden. Every sound seemed too large, too careless, for what was about to happen. The photographer worked alone or with one assistant, a boy who learned early that silence was the first rule of the trade. They communicated in gestures, a nod, a hand raised, a finger pressed to the lips. Even grief seemed to know better than to speak here. The mother entered first, her steps tentative, her eyes red but dry. Behind her, wrapped in white, came the body of her child, carried by 2 women in mourning dress. They laid the little form upon a cushioned chair in the center of the room. The mother stood near the window, clutching her gloves, unable to look yet unable to turn away. The photographer bowed slightly, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He began to move around the room, pulling cords, adjusting blinds, angling mirrors so that a soft light fell across the small, still face. The silence deepened as he prepared his plate. A drop of collodion hissed as it met the glass, spreading in iridescent ripples like oil on water. The chemicals caught the faintest light and shimmered for a moment, before settling into dull opacity. The smell filled the room, sharp, metallic, unforgettable. For those few minutes, the mother felt dizzy, as if she were standing on the edge of something vast and invisible. The photographer approached the chair, his hands steady. He adjusted the body with a gentleness that bordered on reverence, turning the head slightly toward the window, arranging the fingers over a small book or a sprig of flowers. Sometimes, when the family could bear it, he placed a favorite toy in the child's lap. Each detail mattered. In the final image, even a single crease of cloth would tell a story. When everything was ready, he nodded once to the mother. She came forward, placed her hand on the child's shoulder, and whispered something only the dead could hear. The photographer lifted the black cloth, disappeared beneath it, and the world narrowed to breath and stillness. The click of the shutter broke the air like a prayer cut short. The boy counted under his breath 1, 2, 3, and then the silence returned. The photographer emerged, pale and sweating, holding the exposed plate as though it was something holy. "It is done," he murmured. The mother nodded but did not move. She stood there long after he had carried the plate away to develop it, her eyes fixed on the empty chair. In another room, a faint image was already forming on the glass, shadows turning to flesh, absence turning to presence. The photographer leaned close, watching the dead child's features emerge from the blur, her eyelids heavy, her lips soft with the illusion of life. Outside, a carriage wheel rolled past, muffled by the fog, and for a single fragile moment, the photograph breathed. There was an art to it, one that few dared to name aloud. Making the dead appear alive required patience, precision, and a certain cold courage that most men lost somewhere between the first and second body. The Victorian photographer learned to balance mercy with deception, to treat each child's corpse as both sacred relic and delicate machinery. The goal was not to preserve death, but to mimic breath. The smallest movements were the enemy. Even in stillness, the human body betrayed the weight of time, joints loosening, the subtle fall of the head, the slow shift of gravity claiming what life had left behind. The photographer's job was to resist that surrender. His tools were not brushes or chisels, but iron rods, silk cords, and wooden stands disguised beneath folds of fabric. The posing stand, as it was called, became infamous. To the grieving mother, it looked like nothing more than a prop. To the man behind the lens, it was the only thing that could make the illusion hold. He adjusted it with the care of a surgeon, the iron rod rising behind the chair to cradle the neck, a clamp hidden under lace to keep the chin from drooping. Some versions had padded grips to support the spine. Others used wires that disappeared into sleeves or under skirts, holding the wrists at an angle of serenity. When done properly, the dead could sit upright, eyes open, as if waiting to be spoken to. Only the faintest stiffness betrayed the truth. The mothers often asked if the process hurt, and the photographer, always gentle, always careful with his tone, assured them it did not. He would wait until they left the room before beginning. Death had its own rhythm, and he had learned to follow it, moving slowly, speaking softly to no one. Sometimes he whispered apologies under his breath, not out of guilt, but out of habit. The silence pressed so close that even the sound of his own voice felt like proof that he was still among the living. Lighting was everything. Too much, brightness, and the pallor became grotesque. Too little, and the illusion of warmth disappeared. He angled mirrors toward the face, letting a single shaft of sunlight catch the edge of an eyelash, a curl of hair. The eyes, if left open, required delicate attention. A drop of gelatin or glass powder gave them a false glimmer, a wetness that fooled even those who had known the child in life. For the closed-eyed portraits, he painted faint shadows above the lids, mimicking the weight of slumber. When the exposure was finally taken, he held his breath. Every second counted. Too brief, and the image would vanish. Too long, and decay would win. He counted slowly, one heartbeat at a time, his fingers trembling on the brass shutter. When he released it, the studio seemed to exhale. Afterward, he removed the supports with care, wiped the rods clean, and folded the linen back over the small, cooling body. The illusion would last forever, but he still took a moment to whisper his thanks to the mother, to the child, to whatever mystery allowed death to be so quietly obedient to art. Outside, carriages rolled past, and the city roared. But within those velvet-draped walls, the photographer had achieved what no priest or doctor could promise. For the length of one captured breath, death had been persuaded to hold still. They were always the hardest part. The eyes refused to cooperate with illusion. They betrayed stillness, told the truth that the lips, the hands, and the careful pose tried so desperately to hide. For the Victorian photographer, the face could be arranged, the limbs could be coaxed into grace, but the eyes? They were portals that had already closed. When a client insisted that their loved one's eyes remain open, the photographer's heart always sank a little. It was possible, of course it was all possible, but it demanded the cruelest kind of artistry. Some used small wooden wedges to lift the lids just enough for the iris to show. Others applied gum arabic to stiffen them in place. A few dared to paint faint pupils directly onto the lids after they had been shut forever. Those were the most convincing portraits, the illusion so subtle that even a mother could be deceived by her own hope. The studio boy, pale and silent, always fetched the tools. Brushes no thicker than a pin, a pot of diluted ink, a small bottle of glycerin. The photographer would lean close to the child's face, his breath shallow, his hand steady. With the gentlest touch, he would paint light itself, a dark curve here, a gleam there. A tiny drop of glycerin on the corner of each lid would catch the reflection of the lamp, giving the eyes the illusion of moisture, of life. When finished, he would step back, and there it was, the miracle and the horror, blended together in one fragile instant. The dead child appeared to look back. The room itself seemed to flinch. The mother, who had been sitting behind the curtain with her gloved hands pressed to her mouth, would rise and approach, afraid to breathe. She would touch her daughter's cheek, whisper her name, and for a heartbeat believe that she had returned. Yet the photographer knew better. He knew that the eyes were liars. The chemical plates would later reveal what human sight could not: small distortions, faint halos of light that gathered around the pupils, an unnatural gleam. Some called it the soul light, claiming that the camera caught what lingered between life and departure. Others whispered that the dead resented the imitation, that their gaze, once painted and photographed, would never truly close. There were stories of photographs falling from walls in the night, of plates developing strange, duplicate faces, of eyes that seemed to follow whoever dared to look too long. Most dismissed them as superstition, but even the most rational men found themselves covering those portraits with cloth after dark. There was something unnerving in the stare of a person who should not see. In truth, the photographer felt it too. When he developed the plates in his dim back room, he sometimes caught his reflection in the glass beside theirs. His own living eyes met the painted gaze of the dead, and for a moment he could not tell which were more convincing. He would set the plate aside, step back, and feel a shiver crawl up his spine. Still, he continued, the families demanded it. They wanted their children's eyes open, awake, eternal, untouched by decay. And so, night after night, he painted the lie of life over the truth of death. When he locked the studio each evening, he would blow out the lamps and feel dozens of unseen stares behind him, glittering faintly in the dark. Outside, London's fog pressed against the windows like a shroud. Inside, 100 unblinking eyes waited for the dawn. The hardest part was not the photograph, it was the waiting. Hours passed inside the parlor, and time thickened like syrup. The mother sat perfectly still in her high-backed chair, her child cradled in her lap, the photographer adjusting mirrors and curtains in patient silence. Outside, the city churned in its ordinary chaos, carriages clattering, street vendors calling, but in this room, the world had narrowed to a single pulse that no longer beat. Her hand trembled once, then steadied. It rested on the small shoulder of the child, fingers spread gently, as though afraid that any firmer touch might wake her. The photographer noticed how pale the knuckles had become, how the fabric of her mourning sleeve had creased from the strain of holding still. She had been asked not to move for the duration of the exposure, and she had agreed without a word. He suspected she would have sat there all night if he had asked her to. In the early days of post-mortem photography, mothers were often part of the composition. The Victorians called it the hand of love. That visible connection between life and death meant to comfort the viewer and remind them that the bond between them had not been severed. It was an unspoken rule. The mother's touch anchored the photograph in the living world. Without it, the image might drift too far into the uncanny, into something that even grief could not justify. The camera's brass lens loomed in front of her, the photographer murmuring to his assistant. Light pooled through the lace curtains, soft and golden, falling across her face. Her eyes glistened not with tears, but with a strange calm, the calm of someone who has passed through hysteria into numb devotion. She no longer thought of herself as being photographed. She thought only of her child, of how the little head leaned against her arm the way it used to during fevered nights. "Hold her close," the photographer whispered. His voice trembled too, though he did not mean fit to. She obeyed. Her fingers brushed the child's curls, smoothing them down with care. The air in the room seemed to shift, one of those invisible moments when emotion becomes almost physical, heavy enough to breathe in. When the shutter finally opened, the mother exhaled softly. The sound was like the last note of a lullaby. For several seconds she did not move, her palm pressed over the child's heart. Then the photographer lowered his head and whispered, "It's done." She nodded, her face unreadable. He busied himself with cleaning the lens, but he could feel the weight of her stillness behind him. She did not release the child immediately. She continued to hold her, as if the warmth of her own body might coax some forgotten spark back into the small frame she carried. When at last she did let go, she placed a kiss on the child's temple and folded the little hands over the chest. As she rose, she thanked him in a voice so faint it was almost a breath. "You've given her back to me," she said. He wanted to tell her that it wasn't true, that no photograph could ever return what death had claimed, but he couldn't bring himself to say it. When she left, her gloves still damp from tears, he saw that a faint mark remained on the child's shoulder, the print of her mother's hand. It would appear in the final photograph, ghost-like and gentle, a reminder that even in death, a mother's touch refuses to fade. In the age before photographs, grief was absolute. When someone died, the living had only memory, fragile, unreliable, already fading by the time the coffin lid closed. But the Victorians discovered something terrible and tender, that the camera could make forgetting harder. The portrait of a dead child, of a still husband, of a quiet wife, became both miracle and curse, a way to look directly at loss and refuse to believe it. They called them memento mori, though the phrase had changed its meaning. Once, it had been a reminder to prepare for death. Now, it was an argument against it. Families displayed these photographs proudly on mantels, beside living portraits, as though death itself were merely another stage of life. The illusion was comforting, soothing, even, but in the quiet hours, when the house slept, that comfort turned uneasy. The eyes in the frame did not close. The child forever smiled, forever sat upright, forever breathed in the stillness of a moment stolen from decay. The mothers clung to these portraits as if they were relics of sainthood. They would dust the glass daily, speak to it, sometimes even apologize when they moved it from one table to another. Some confessed to feeling the child's presence strongest when they held the photograph close, its coldness pressing against their skin like a second pulse. To love the dead was expected. To love their image too much was not. Yet it was happening all over London, all over Manchester, all over the empire, a quiet epidemic of longing that no doctor could name. The photographers knew it too. When families returned weeks later for more prints, they recognized the hunger in their eyes. They wanted more than likeness. They wanted proof. Proof that their beloved still existed somewhere, that the light which once touched their face had not vanished but lived eternally in silver and glass. The photograph was not merely remembrance, it was resurrection. Some families took it further. There were commissions for living composites photographs where the living were spliced beside their dead, their figures combined by exposure trickery into a single impossible image. In one, a grieving father sat with his hand upon his son's shoulder, though the boy had been buried for weeks. In another, a young mother gazed lovingly at a child who floated faintly beside her, half transparent, like a thought unfinished. For a society steeped in faith and propriety, these images were acts of quiet rebellion. To deny the finality of death was, in its own way, blasphemy, but a blasphemy born of love. The Victorians could not cure disease, could not halt decay, but they could command light and chemistry to lie for them. And they did, again and again. When visitors came calling, these portraits were shown with a polite smile. This was taken the day before she fell ill, someone would say, though both parties knew it was a fiction. The lie was not malicious, it was protective, a shield against the cruelty of truth. At night, when the lamps burned low, those same visitors might glance toward the mantel and see the faint shimmer of the photograph in the dark. They might feel the unease of being watched by someone whose breath no longer stirred the air. Yet, they would not look away. Because in that soft, merciful deceit in those portraits of denial, the Victorians found the only kind of immortality they could understand, one preserved not in flesh, but in faith. By the middle of the 19th century, death had become a business. Not a metaphor, not a sermon, but a thriving industry that fed on sorrow and sentiment. In the crowded heart of London, entire streets were dedicated to mourning. Photographers beside undertakers, florists beside coffin makers, haberdashers selling bolts of black crepe by the yard. The wealthy ordered mourning jewelry carved from jet or onyx, while the poor paid in weekly installments for photographs that promised eternity. Grief, once sacred and private, was now something that could be purchased. In every district, there was a photographer who specialized in post-mortem portraits. Their advertisements were discreet, small cards slipped into newspapers, bearing phrases like remembrances in memoriam or faithful likenesses. No one needed to say what they really meant. The families knew. They arrived in carriages at dawn, shrouded in black, carrying small boxes wrapped in cloth. The photographers did not ask who was inside until the doors were closed and the blinds drawn. There was money in mourning. The upper classes paid lavishly for artful compositions, angelic drapery, painted backdrops, cherubs or clouds added by hand after development. For the middle class, there were cheaper packages, a single tintype, uncolored but eternal, often taken in haste before decay could claim the face. And for the poor, itinerant photographers offered home sittings, bringing their heavy equipment to the bedside of the newly departed, charging by the plate. It was not uncommon for a widow to pawn her wedding ring to afford just one photograph. Competition was fierce. Some studios boasted of their natural repose, promising to make the dead appear peacefully asleep rather than rigid and cold. Others offered spiritual likenesses, claiming to capture not only the form but the very essence of the departed. Many blurred the boundary between truth and spectacle, knowing that grief made even the most rational minds believe what they wished to see. The photographers were not cruel men. They saw themselves as craftsmen serving a necessary tenderness. They dealt with sorrow every day, handling it like glass, delicate, dangerous, easily shattered. But their work took a toll. Some began to drink to steady their hands. Others fell silent, losing the ability to speak of anything other than light, exposure, and emulsion. A few went mad. There were stories of photographers who swore they saw their subjects move when the plate developed, of faces appearing behind those they had just photographed. They never spoke of it in daylight. Outside the studio, the business of mourning stretched far beyond the lens. Mourning warehouses sold everything from black-edged stationery to funeral parasols. Newspapers published notices bordered in thick black lines, while railway companies offered reduced fares for funeral travelers. Even grief had become mechanized, timed, priced, and advertised. And yet, for all its commerce, there was something profoundly human at its core. Beneath every transaction lay a desperate need to remember, to defy the erasure that death demanded. The photographers may have sold images, but what they truly traded in was mercy, the promise that the beloved would not vanish entirely. At night, when the last client had gone and the lamps burned low, the photographer would sometimes sit in his darkroom surrounded by dozens of drying portraits. Faces still, perfect, forever unchanging, stared back at him from the racks. He would pour another glass of brandy, telling himself he was preserving love. But deep down he knew the truth. Grief had become his livelihood, and in serving the mourning of others, he had forgotten how to mourn himself. He was never named in the ledgers. The assistants rarely were. In most studios there was always one, a boy of 12 or 13, small enough to move quietly through narrow spaces, obedient enough to never question what he was told to do. They called him lad, boy, or simply you. He learned early that his job was not to see, only to obey. Each morning began with the same ritual. He swept the studio floors, wiped the lenses free of dust, and polished the brass fixtures until they gleamed like coins. The photographer arrived later, always pale, always tired, smelling faintly of chemicals and cigars. By then, the boy already knew if there would be a body that day. He could tell by the silence of the street outside, by the way mothers approached the door, heads bowed, a small parcel wrapped in linen held close to the chest. The boy's task was to assist in preparing the body. He was the one who fetched the warm water, the lavender oil, the comb. Sometimes he held the small form upright while the photographer adjusted the stand, the iron brace cold against his fingers. He tried not to look at their faces. He told himself they were sleeping, though he knew better. The air always grew heavy when the curtains were drawn and the mirrors covered, as if the room itself understood what was coming. He had nightmares about their eyes, not when they were open, but when they were closed. In dreams, they fluttered as if trying to wake. Once, when the photographer's hands trembled during a long exposure, he barked at the boy to hold the head steady. The boy obeyed, his thumb brushing the child's cheek. The skin was cool and softer than anything he had ever touched. When the plate was finally taken and the image emerged, the photographer smiled and said, "Perfect. It's as if she's breathing." The boy could not stop staring at the faint impression of his own thumbprint left on the glass. There were rules. Never speak to the mothers. Never make noise when the shutter opened. Never, under any circumstance, cry. He followed them all. But when the photographer left for supper one evening, the boy lingered in the dark room. He held one of the finished plates up to the lamplight. A girl's face looked back, eyes wide, mouth parted slightly, as though she might speak. Her name had already escaped him, if he had ever heard it at all. In that quiet moment, he whispered an apology to her, to all of them, and placed the plate gently back on its rack. The lamplight flickered, catching in the glass, and for an instant it seemed as though the girl blinked. He dropped the plate in shock. It shattered at his feet, a sound so sharp it seemed to slice through the heavy air. When the photographer returned and saw the shards, he said nothing. He simply sent the boy home early. That night, as the boy walked through the fog toward his narrow lodgings, he swore he heard footsteps behind him, small, deliberate, childlike. He did not turn around. In the morning, he would sweep the floors again, polish the lenses, and wait for the next knock at the door. For behind every curtain in that silent studio, another child was always waiting. By dawn, the parlor smelled of wilted blossoms, roses, lilies, violets. Forget-me-nots. Every stem that the city's florists could spare found its way into the room, their color dimmed beneath the gray light that slipped through the curtains. In the Victorian age, flowers were more than decoration. They were language. Each bloom spoke what grief could not bear to say aloud. The mother had chosen white roses first, purity, innocence, eternity. But the florist, a thin man with soil under his nails, had suggested adding lilies, two symbols of the soul's return to heaven. He spoke with quiet assurance, as though reciting scripture. When she asked for violets, he nodded knowingly. "For remembrance," he said. "They fade quickly. but they leave a scent behind. By the time the photographer arrived, the child's body was nearly hidden beneath the arrangements. Garlands wound through her hair, petals were tucked into the folds of her gown. A single rose lay across her hands like a final offering. The photographer hesitated in the doorway. Even after years of such work, the sight unsettled him. It was as if the room itself were trying to mask the truth, to disguise death beneath sweetness and bloom. The assistant cleared a space for the tripod. The scent was overwhelming, thick, cloying, more perfume than air. As the photographer prepared his plate, he watched how the candlelight trembled over the petals, making them shimmer like skin. The flowers, too, were alive once, he thought. Now they wilted beside her, companions in slow surrender. When he positioned the camera, the mother asked whether the flowers should stay. "All of them," he said softly. "They'll hold the light." She nodded, though her gaze was fixed, not on the arrangement, but on her child's lips, which had begun to pale. He worked quickly. Death was patient, but not still. The body changed even as he framed the shot. He would have only one chance to make the illusion believable. As the exposure began, the room held its breath. The mother's shadow wavered faintly against the wall. The photographer counted silently, hand poised over the shutter. He noticed how the petals trembled in the draft, as if the flowers themselves were exhaling. When the plate was finally taken, he lifted it toward the window. The faint image glowed within the glass, the child surrounded by light, her face serene, the roses gleaming white as snow. He let the mother look. She covered her mouth with her glove and wept without sound. "She looks as if she's sleeping in a garden," she whispered. The photographer said nothing. He had heard that phrase too many times before. Later, when the family left, he gathered the spent blooms from the floor. Some were still fresh enough to keep, others already browning at the edges. He placed a few petals inside his ledger, pressed flat between pages, a private ritual he never explained. By morning, the room would be cleared, the scent of flowers replaced by the faint tang of collodion. Yet something of it would linger, the sweetness, the ache, the deception of beauty that tried so hard to soften death. And in every photograph that followed, the flowers would remain, silent witnesses to the Victorians' greatest act of tenderness and their most delicate denial. There were moments inside the studio when time ceased to exist, not in the romantic way poets spoke of, but in a heavy, physical sense, the kind that made the air thick, the silence hum, and the living feel like trespassers. The Victorians called it the still hour, that uncertain space between the last breath and the shutter's click, when grief became ritual and the room forgot how to move. The photographer lived inside that hour every day. He had come to know the weight of stillness so well that it seemed to follow him even when he left the studio. He could feel it in churchyards, in drawing rooms, on fog-bound streets where the bells of street pools tolled through the haze. Stillness clung to his coat like ash. Sometimes, as he walked home through the narrow alleys, he would notice how the world itself seemed to freeze, the cats pausing mid-step, the gaslight trembling but never breaking, the faint echo of footsteps behind him dissolving before they reached his ears. Inside the studio, stillness was both a necessity and a burden. The success of his craft depended upon it. Any movement, any tremor of air, could ruin a plate. Yet the quietness that surrounded the dead was not the same as peace. It was suffocating. He felt it press against his ribs, hum beneath the surface of his skull. The silence of death was not absence, it was presence. It filled the room with a kind of density that no sound could cut through. He often wondered if his living subjects felt it too. The mothers who sat holding their children would fall into that trance almost immediately, their breathing slowing, their eyes unfocused, as though some invisible gravity pulled them toward the body they held. The photographer watched it happen again and again, grief transforming into stillness, stillness into devotion. It was as if the living and the dead were conspiring together, refusing to let motion betray what love demanded must endure. The longer he worked, the more he began to understand that stillness was contagious. After years behind the camera, His own body began to mimic the dead he photographed. His hands trembled less, his breath shortened, his heart slowed during exposures. When he stood before the lens to test the light, he found he could hold perfectly still for entire minutes, not blinking, not breathing deeply, not existing in the ordinary way. Sometimes he caught his reflection in the glass plate, a face unmoving, expressionless, hollow-eyed. He looked less like a man and more like one of his own subjects, suspended between life and something quieter. Once, a client returned months after her sitting to show him the finished frame. "It feels alive," she said softly, touching the glass. "It's as though she's only waiting." He nodded, but inside he felt the familiar heaviness settle in his chest. They all said the same thing, and yet, when he looked at the photographs lined along his shelves, he saw only stillness, each one a captured silence, a perfect imitation of life that could never again draw breath. At dusk, when he extinguished the lamps, the room seemed to sigh in relief. The stillness retreated into the corners, patient, waiting for the next commission. He would lock the door behind him, knowing it would be there again in the morning. It was loyal, in its own way, eternal. The kind of silence that outlives everyone who dares to listen to it too long. The clergy had always preached that death was sacred, that the body was merely a vessel, the soul already gone to God. Yet, as the century crept on and the art of photography spread through every class, the churches of Britain began to sense something unsettling, stirring among their congregants. People were not letting go. They were keeping their dead close, not in memory, not in faith, but in images. Images that looked too real, too alive, too unwilling to die. At first, the church tolerated it. The priests saw the portraits of the deceased children displayed on parlor mantels, beside crucifixes and holy cards, and they said nothing. They told themselves it was a form of comfort, a harmless imitation of devotion. But soon, questions began to rise in the sermons and the vestries. Was it not idolatry to gaze upon the likeness of a corpse and whisper prayers to it? Did these new mourning portraits not border on necromancy, the temptation to call the spirit back from its proper rest? In parish after parish, ministers found themselves wrestling with an unease they could not name. The families who once knelt at funerals with folded hands now stayed home longer with the body, awaiting the photographer. The undertaker waited in the hall until the exposure was complete. Sometimes the clergy themselves were summoned not for prayer, but to ensure that the soul would not resent being so closely recalled. One vicar in Sussex wrote in his diary that a grieving mother had asked if blessing the camera would guard the child from being trapped inside it. The camera, that mechanical eye, that box of glass and brass and chemicals, some began to whisper that it meddled too closely with divine order. "God alone grants eternity," said one bishop in an 1863 address, and we court danger when we try to make eternity in miniature with mortal hands. Yet, even as the pulpit warned, the pews were filled with those who carried small photographs inside their Bibles, tucked between the Psalms like secret relics. They prayed over them, touched them before sleep, and felt something closer than faith proof. Others within the church took a softer view. The more progressive clergy argued that photography was not heresy but healing, a means for the afflicted to bear their crosses. "If an image brings a mother peace," one London chaplain wrote, "then perhaps that too is the mercy of God." But such words found little comfort among those who feared that science was stealing the sacred. To them, every flash of magnesium light felt like a spark of rebellion. Every photograph, another temptation to worship the image instead of the eternal. Yet even the most devout ministers could not resist the quiet pull of the lens. When cholera swept through their towns and half their parishioners lay buried before the next Sunday's Mass, some priests were found in studios themselves, having portraits taken of their lost families. They did not confess it from the pulpit. They simply prayed harder afterward. In the end, the church's unease was not truly about sin, but about surrender. The Victorians were learning that they could hold death in their hands, that grief could be captured, printed, and kept. For a world built on faith in resurrection, that was a dangerous revelation that the camera, not the cross, had become the new instrument of remembrance, and while priests spoke of heaven, the people of Britain were quietly building their own small heavens in silver and glass. Long before the camera became a window into the afterlife, death itself had been the domain of physicians and anatomists, men who charted the slow unraveling of the body with the same fascination others reserved for the stars. In the Victorian age, science was both savior and executioner, promising knowledge while dismantling mystery, and nowhere did its precision feel more intimate or more intrusive than in the moment when a doctor bent over a fading child and announced the final breath. Yet even that was not always certain. In those decades, medicine was haunted by confusion. The difference between sleep, coma, catalepsy, and death was not as clear as anyone wished it to be. Cases appeared in newspapers with alarming frequency. Women buried too soon, men found clawing at coffin lids, infants pronounced dead only to stir again in their mother's arms. The terror of premature burial was so widespread that inventors patented safety coffins equipped with bells and breathing tubes. Death had become a science, but an imprecise one, trembling on the edge of guesswork. The new physicians prided themselves on their instruments. Stethoscopes, thermometers, scalpels polished like jewelry. They mapped the stages of decay, recorded the fading pulse, catalogued the stiffening limbs. To them, death was a process, not an instant. And so, when photographers entered the same homes, kneeling beside the same bedsides, they became part of this new clinical order. Their work, too, was an experiment, a test of how long light could deceive the eye, how far chemistry could stall oblivion. Sometimes, doctors and photographers worked side by side. The physician confirmed that the body had cooled. Then the photographer measured exposure times and light angles, calculating decay's progress as precisely as a diagnosis. In their notebooks, the vocabulary of medicine and art blurred rigor, temperature, discoloration terms, once spoken only in hospitals, now whispered in drawing rooms. Death was no longer private. It was observable, recordable, reproducible. But for all its science, the body remained unpredictable. The photographer often saw what the doctor could not: a twitch in the jaw, a flutter beneath the eyelid. He knew it was only the last residue of life, the nervous echo that haunted the flesh, but still, he waited before taking the plate, just in case. Sometimes, in the silver haze of development, these twitches seemed to linger on the image itself. Faces appeared to smile faintly, eyes half closed as though on the brink of waking. Scientists called it coincidence, optical illusion, a trick of exposure. But others, mothers, fathers, priests, saw something deeper. They whispered that the soul did not depart at once, that perhaps a fragment remained, caught between the shutter and the spirit world. It was not superstition, it was hope, dressed in the vocabulary of reason. By the 1870s, the language of death had changed entirely. Doctors published treatises on its symptoms. Photographers sold proof that it could be gentled. Scientists declared that even mortality could be studied, weighed, and understood. But in all their precision, they missed what every grieving mother already knew. Death was never a moment, it was a lingering, a shadow that refused to leave the room. And as the century deepened, Britain learned to live with that shadow, half faith, half science, all sorrow, each photograph a quiet experiment in defying the laws of nature. In the beginning, no one quite understood what they were dealing with. The early photographers spoke of light as if it were alive, something that could be trapped, tamed, persuaded to obey. The invention of the collodion wet plate in the 1850s transformed that fragile magic into something permanent. A few drops of chemicals, a pane of glass, and suddenly the world could be frozen in silver. Yet those who worked with it daily knew that light was never truly harmless. It had its own temper, its own strange appetite. To make a photograph, the glass plate had to be coated in collodion, a mixture of ether, alcohol, and gun cotton, then dipped in silver nitrate until it glowed faintly like moonlit water. The photographer carried it dripping from the darkroom to the camera, careful not to breathe too deeply. The fumes were sharp enough to sting the lungs. The plate had to be exposed while still wet, and then rushed back into darkness before it dried. In that narrow window of time, everything depended on stillness. When the subject was living, it was difficult enough, but when the subject was dead, the air in the room changed. The light behaved differently, hesitant, unsteady, as though it too recognized what it was touching. Photographers often complained that the images of corpses took longer to develop, that the faces appeared faint at first, reluctant to emerge from the chemical mist. The light resists them, one London photographer wrote in his journal. It hesitates at the edge of flesh that no longer answers. It was during those long exposures that superstition began to creep in. Some said the camera was not just capturing the body but drawing something else from it, a residue, an echo, a trace of the soul. Others claimed that ghosts were born not in graveyards but in dark rooms where light and death mingled on glass. They called the results shadows on glass. When the collodion settled, faint halos would appear around the heads of the commoness. Subjects, small rings of light the photographers could not explain. For the scientists, these effects were simply the play of chemistry, silver halides reacting with ether, moisture, and dust. But for the bereaved, they were signs, proof that their loved ones still lingered. A mother, receiving her child's photograph, would trace the faint halo with her fingertip and whisper, "She's in heaven already." The photographers didn't correct her. To them, belief was good for business. Still, the longer they worked, the more the photographers themselves began to feel the strangeness of it. They spent their days surrounded by half-visible faces, their nights haunted by the smell of ether and the faint shimmer of the glass plates drying in rows. Each portrait felt less like creation and more like invocation. Some swore that if you stared too long into a freshly developed plate, you could see movement, the ghost of breath, the flicker of an eyelash. By the 1860s, many studios began to hang black cloths over the developing racks at night, not for preservation, but for peace of mind. They said the light could never truly be trusted once it had touched the dead, and when morning came, they would lift the covers and find their shadows on glass staring back silent, silver, and impossibly eternal. Those portraits were unlike any others. They seemed to hum faintly with absence, as if the glass remembered what it had seen. To the Victorians, it was evidence that love could defy decay. To the photographers, it was a quiet warning that the camera, too, had begun to dream. In the narrow streets of Whitechapel and the factory quarters of Manchester, grief did not look like velvet drapes or polished coffins. It smelled of coal dust and boiled soap, of damp walls and candle smoke. The working poor buried their dead as best they could with borrowed linen, shared carriages, and faith that the soul, at least, could travel freely even when the body could not. Yet even here, amid the noise and hunger of industrial life, the desire for remembrance took root. The camera, once the instrument of the rich, had found its way into the alleys. The morning room in a labourer's home was often the same place where the family ate, slept, and prayed. When a child died and children died, often the bed was pushed against the wall, the curtains drawn tight to keep out flies, and the door kept shut from neighbours until the photographer arrived. There were no marble angels, no silk veils. The mother's dress was her work apron, washed hastily and blackened with soot. The flowers were handfuls of wild daisy and thyme from the edge of the rail yard. For the itinerant photographers who served the poor, this was their daily pilgrimage. They carried their heavy cameras on their backs, wrapped in rough cloth, and mixed their chemicals from bottles clinking in a wooden crate. Payment was uncertain. Sometimes it came in shillings, sometimes in bread, tea, or an old coat. Once, a woman gave her late husband's pipe as payment, whispering that it had been the only thing he had left that was worth something. The photographer accepted it without protest. The exposures were difficult in such rooms. The light came weakly through soot-streaked windows, and the air was thick with the smell of damp plaster. The children were often wrapped in their mother's shawl or laid upon the table, surrounded by what few possessions the family could gather: a tin toy, a worn Bible, a lock of hair. The photographer would steady the camera on an uneven chair, whisper a prayer under his breath, and count the seconds before the shutter closed. When the image appeared later that night, it was often imperfect. The room was too dark, the air too dense, the plates too thinly coated. Yet to the families, the imperfections were beautiful. They saw halos in the overexposed edges, gentle glows where the light had bled across the child's face. "She's shining," one mother said, pressing the photograph to her chest, "just like the angels." Sometimes, neighbors would gather to see the finished plate, passing it carefully between their rough hands. They spoke in whispers, as though the dead might still be listening. For a few minutes, the room would fill with something almost like reverence, a silence deeper than poverty, stronger than hunger. When the photographer left, he walked through the darkened streets carrying a small stack of drying plates under his arm. He could hear the bells of the workhouse in the distance, marking another hour of labor for the living. Behind him, in one cramped home after another, candles burned low beside the photographs he had made. The poor could not afford marble headstones or grand funerals, but they could afford a single fragment of eternity, pressed into glass. In those dim rooms, among soot and sorrow, death was not an ending but a pause. The photograph did what money could not. It granted dignity, a moment of beauty, to lives too often forgotten. And for one brief, silvered instant, even the poorest mother in London could look upon her child and believe that she had given them something eternal. By the 1870s, the camera had escaped the parlor and entered the streets. What began as a private ritual of mourning was becoming a public spectacle. Newspapers and illustrated weeklies, the Graphic, the Illustrated London News, the Penny Gazette had discovered that sorrow, when framed correctly, could sell as well as scandal. The public had grown hungry for the faces of the dead, and the photographers, always quick to follow profit where sentiment led, obliged. It began innocently enough. A family, proud of their memorial portrait, might share it with a local paper when their child's death drew attention, perhaps from an accident at the mill or an outbreak of fever. The editors published it as a tribute, the image framed by black borders and verses of scripture. But soon, mourning became marketable. Death notices evolved into illustrated narratives, and photography, once the tool of remembrance, became a weapon of fascination. The photographers who supplied these images were often the same men who had once worked quietly in backrooms. Now they were summoned by the editors themselves, paid extra to deliver the first clear likeness of the deceased. Mothers consented, though not without hesitation. Some saw it as an honor that their child's face might live in print, sanctified by ink and public sympathy. Others wept when they saw the image on the front page, surrounded by advertisements for soap and corsets. It was like they had taken her twice. One widow whispered to a journalist, her hands trembling around the clipping. The power of the printed photograph was immediate. A face in the paper could move hundreds to tears, inspire donations for the family, or stir outrage against factory owners, physicians, or politicians. The image of a child lying peacefully in lace became the emblem of purity lost, the moral lesson of an age still trying to reconcile science and faith. Newspapers began to curate grief, choosing which faces would serve which purpose. A boy drowned in the Thames might appear beside an article on public safety. A seamstress dead of exhaustion might illustrate a piece on the plight of working women. The dead had become symbols, and the photographers, whether they knew it or not, were composing arguments as much as memorials. In those years, the boundaries between journalism and mourning blurred. Some photographers retouched the plates before publication, brightening eyes, softening mouths, adding flowers or a hint of a smile. Others refused, claiming that truth itself demanded honesty, but honesty was a fragile thing in the age of ink and silver. The Victorians had long mastered the art of dignified deceit. The public, too, began to expect these images. When disaster struck, a mine collapse, a railway fire, an epidemic, crowds waited for the next issue of the Graphic, eager to see the faces of those they had never met. It was empathy and voyeurism intertwined. Grief had become communal, yet strangely impersonal. In the photographer's studio, stacks of newspaper clippings began to accumulate. He cut out each one that carried his work, pasting them into a small black book. Late at night, he would leaf through it, studying the faces. In print, they seemed even less his own half art, half commodity. The ink bled slightly around their outlines, softening them, erasing their individuality. One night, he held up a clipping of a young girl, his own photograph, published beneath the headline, "Little Angel of the Cholera Outbreak." Her eyes, painted open for the sitting, seemed to stare directly at him through the newsprint. The caption beneath read, "She sleeps, but her image awakens compassion in all who behold her." He closed the book and blew out the lamp. Outside, the presses thundered on, printing grief by the thousands. In the morning, London would wake to her face again, and for one fleeting moment, the entire city would believe they knew her. It began with a mistake, or so the story went. A photographer in Bristol had accidentally exposed one glass plate over another, producing an image in which two figures appeared where only one had posed. When he developed it, a faint, translucent face hovered beside the sitter, its outline soft, its gaze serene. The customer, a recent widow, gasped when she saw it. "It's him," she whispered, pressing a trembling finger to the spectral blur. "My husband." She paid double for the print, kissed the image, and left in tears. News of the miracle photograph spread like fog over the country. The Victorians, who had already turned death into art, now began to believe the camera could also prove the existence of the soul. Within months, so-called spirit photographers were advertising in London and Edinburgh, promising to reveal not just the face of the departed, but their presence. Studios darkened their windows and filled with believers who wished to see what the human eye could not. It was the perfect marriage of superstition and science. The collodion process, with its long exposures and ghostly transparencies, seemed almost designed to deceive or to inspire faith, depending on the viewer's need. A smudge of dust, a lingering double exposure, a trace of breath on the glass, each became a visitation. Photographers exploited it with care. Some even kept a collection of ghost negatives, faint faces of previous clients that they could superimpose onto any new portrait. To the bereaved, every flicker of light became divine proof that love had crossed the veil. Skeptics were horrified. Newspapers accused the new photographers of blasphemy, while scientists and clergymen united briefly in outrage. Pamphlets circulated condemning the practice as a commerce of deceit, yet the crowds kept coming. Faith, it seemed, did not require evidence, it only needed an image. Even those who claimed not to believe found themselves leaning closer, eyes searching, the silver plate for some sign of movement. The notion that a machine could reveal what the spirit world concealed was too intoxicating to dismiss. In some portraits, the ghosts appeared behind the living, soft faces peering over shoulders, hands resting lightly on arms. Others were subtler still, faint veils of light that hinted at a hovering soul. The families spoke to these photographs as if to altars. One woman brought a print of her husband to a séance, setting it on the table beside the candles. When the medium called the spirit forth, the flame flickered, and she swore his eyes brightened in the photograph. The true photographers, the ones who had begun with mourning portraits rather than manipulation, watched this new trade with quiet dismay. They recognized in it a reflection of their own work, stretched into deception. Had they not also trafficked in illusions, pretending that death could be softened by art? They told themselves their purpose was comfort, not fraud, yet the boundary between the two was dissolving. By the time the century reached its last decades, spirit photography had become its own religion. Studios filled with incense, whispers, and trembling hands. The camera's click sounded less like a machine and more like invocation. And somewhere between chemistry and faith, between trickery and yearning, the Victorians found themselves gazing into their own creation, a haunting mirror of their century's greatest fear and its deepest desire, that the dead, through light and longing, might refuse to leave the frame. The smallest coffins carried the heaviest weight. In the parlors and narrow flats of Victorian England, The death of a child was both commonplace and unthinkable. It happened so often that language itself softened to protect the living. Children did not die. They were taken, called, or gone to sleep. Yet for every polite euphemism, there remained a mother sitting in silence, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the small, still face that had once filled the house with noise. The mourning child became the era's most photographed subject, not because of morbid curiosity, but because children embodied innocence. Their portraits were pure, unmarred by the cynicism of adult sorrow. In the photograph, death seemed gentler when it touched a child. The curled fingers, the parted lips, the delicate features arranged in peaceful repose, these were images that soothed the conscience of a society drowning in soot, disease, and loss. A child's photograph promised something redemptive, that purity could outlast pain. In homes where siblings still slept three to a bed, the ritual unfolded the same way. The photographer was summoned quietly, often before dawn. The mother dressed the child in Sunday clothes, brushing the hair one final time, pinning ribbons that trembled in her shaking hands. She whispered to the body as she worked, small endearments meant for no one but herself. When the photographer arrived, she would ask, "Can her brothers be in the picture?" And he would nod, though he knew what that meant. The living children would be placed beside their sister or brother, told to hold still, to smile if they could. They were old enough to understand, yet too young to name the fear in their throats. In the final photograph, they appeared calm, angelic even, but the truth was otherwise. One might grip the edge of the chair too tightly, another might avert his eyes toward the floor. The camera caught all of it, the innocence, the confusion, the first education in grief. For families too poor for painters or gravestones, these photographs were heirlooms. Mothers wore them in lockets, close to the skin, while fathers carried them folded in wallets worn smooth by use. Children grew up staring at the images of siblings they barely remembered, their earliest memories shaped by a photograph rather than a voice. Whole generations of Victorians were raised with ghosts at the dinner table, faces framed on walls, hands clasped in eternal prayer. In the factories and mines where child labor filled the workday, the photographs took on another purpose: protest. Reformers and social crusaders began to use the images of dead children as moral evidence, proof that poverty itself was a kind of violence. Pamphlets distributed through London showed pale faces framed in flowers beside headlines demanding better sanitation, safer workhouses, cleaner water. The children who could no longer speak became martyrs of progress, their silence a condemnation that thundered louder than sermons. Yet in the private spaces of the home, those photographs were not politics, they were prayer. Each image was both a farewell and a plea. Remember her, remember him. A parent would trace the contours of the face each night before bed, whispering, "Good night, my darling," as though the photograph could hear. And perhaps, in some way, it did. For even now, in forgotten albums and dust-covered frames, those small, unblinking eyes still meet ours, innocent, unaging, unforgotten. They remind us that grief was once an everyday visitor, and that love, even when frozen in silver, was the one thing the Victorians refused to let die. Before the age of telegrams and telephones, grief moved through paper. Every household that lost someone, be it a child, a father, or a wife, announced it first through ink. The mourning letter was both confession and performance, its words trembling between duty and despair. Across Britain, black-edged stationery became as common as bread. You could tell at a glance when death had entered a home. The envelopes arrived bordered in thick lines of ink, sealing sorrow in the shape of civility. In the cramped rooms of tenements and townhouses alike, families gathered at the kitchen table to write. The widow took up her pen, her sleeve brushing the inkpot, her words deliberate and slow. "It has pleased the Lord to take our little Mary." Always the same phrasing, always softened by faith. To write otherwise, to say, "She is dead," was too brutal, too indecent for polite society. Death, even when it sat in the next room, had to be filtered through reverence. The first letters were for kin, cousins in Leeds, grandparents in Devon, brothers serving abroad. Then came the second round to the schoolmaster, the parish, the employer, the neighbours. Each received their portion of grief written in looping cursive. Some families enclosed locks of hair, tied with black ribbon, or a tiny pressed flower from the funeral garland. These tokens, half relic, turned mourning into something tactile. The recipients would place them in drawers or within family Bibles, where they would rest for generations like fragile ghosts of affection. Printers, sensing a new market, began producing mourning paper in every variety. Heavy cream sheets edged in jet black for widows, pale grey for half mourning, suitable after 6 months had passed. Delicate lilac borders for children and young maidens. Even the ink changed tone. Pure black was for immediate loss, diluted grey for those reconciled. To misjudge the etiquette was to invite gossip. Some widows were said to have extended their black edges too long, accused of parading grief. Others moved to lighter stationery too soon, as if forgetting were a social sin. But not every letter obeyed convention. In the darker corners of the city, where factory soot blackened the air before the ink ever could, some wrote without grace or pretense. Their letters were brief, unadorned, often stained with tears or coal dust. He coughed himself to death. We did our best. No scripture, no polite condolences, only the plain ache of survival. Those words, though lacking elegance, were truer than all the flowery condolences sent from drawing rooms miles away. When the letters were posted, the mourning continued in ritual. The ink-stained hands were washed, the envelopes sealed with wax impressed by the family crest or a simple cross. The postman became the silent carrier of tragedy, his satchel heavy with sorrow. In some small towns, he was known to remove his hat when delivering black-edged mail. Later, when the shock dulled, the families would gather the returned letters and clippings into a box, their archive of grief. Inside were thank-you notes from friends, printed prayers, and sometimes the photograph itself, tucked carefully between folded sheets. Together, they formed a paper mausoleum, a place where memory and language tried to keep pace with love. Years later, descendants would open these boxes and find the handwriting faint but legible, the ink browned like dried blood, the words still murmured through time, restrained, proper, aching. Ink and ashes, the two mediums through which the Victorians spoke to the dead. Every home kept its ghosts, but none so proudly as the widows of Victorian England. For them, mourning was not a period of time, it was a vocation. The death of a husband transformed a woman into something between priestess and prisoner, bound by etiquette, ritual, and devotion to memory. Her house became a shrine, her dress a uniform, her every breath an act of reverence for the man who no longer drew his own. And at the heart of it all stood her gallery, a collection of portraits, relics, and photographs, a private museum of grief. The widow's gallery was rarely large. Sometimes it filled only a small table draped in black crepe, other times an entire wall where frames hung in careful rows. Here were the photographs of the dead husband in his prime, the wedding daguerreotype, the family group before the children scattered, and finally, the posthumous portrait, the one taken after his final breath. She would light candles beside it each evening, arranging fresh flowers and dusting the frames until the silver gleamed. To step into that room was to feel time slow, as if the air itself had conspired to preserve the moment before he died. Queen Victoria set the standard, as she always did. Her endless mourning for Prince Albert, 40 years of black dresses, sealed rooms, and portraits, became the moral compass of a grieving nation. If the Queen could remain faithful to memory, so too could every respectable widow in Britain. Photographers knew it well, their studios filled with women clutching locks of hair or holding photographs of their late husbands, their faces half-shadowed by veils of bombazine. They wanted to look like Victoria, dignified, saintly, and inconsolable. For many widows, the gallery became a daily companion. Some spoke aloud to the photographs while taking tea, Others wrote letters to their husbands and tucked them behind the frames. "Dearest," one widow wrote in 1878, "I fear to live beyond the day your image fades." She did not know that the photograph, sealed and silvered, would outlast her by a century. Visitors often felt uneasy in these rooms. The dead man's gaze followed them from every angle, his presence dominating even the living conversation. When guests attempted polite chatter, the widow would often interrupt to recount some detail of his final moments or how still his face had been when the photographer came. The living were an afterthought in such spaces. The true household existed in glass and memory. Even as years passed, the widows rarely dismantled their galleries. They became fixtures of domestic architecture, as essential as the hearth. Children grew up beneath those unblinking faces, learning that love meant endurance, that devotion should never fade, only deepen into ritual. Some inherited the galleries after their mothers died, adding their own portraits to the wall until the living and dead were indistinguishable. In the quiet of evening, the widow would sit before her display, fingers folded in her lap, the ticking of the clock echoing through the room like a slow pulse. The candlelight shimmered on the glass, turning the faces momentarily lifelike. She knew it was only reflection, but it comforted her all the same, for in that flicker, brief, trembling, and bright, she could believe that devotion had defeated time and that her husband still looked back at her from the far side of eternity. The Victorians feared many things: disease, poverty, damnation, but none so deeply as being forgotten. Death was inevitable, oblivion was intolerable. It was not the grave they dreaded, but the slow erasure that followed, when the living went on and the sound of a name faded from use. That terror, quiet and patient, was what drove them to cling so fiercely to photographs, hair lockets, mourning letters, and every relic that could anchor memory to the world of the breathing. Forgetfulness, to a Victorian mind, was betrayal. Sermons warned of it, poems romanticized against it. In parlors and chapels, people spoke of remembrance as both duty and salvation. "We die twice," one preacher said in a London pulpit in 1864, "once when the breath leaves the body, and again when the last tongue ceases to speak our name." The congregation wept, for they all knew that second death was the one their new machines, their cameras, their albums, their memorial jewelry were built to resist. A mother might open a drawer and find her child's photograph years after the burial, the silver surface dulled, but the face intact. She would weep again, not for the loss, but for the mercy of remembering. Fathers, stoic and weary, carried small portraits in their waistcoat pockets to finger in moments of solitude. Even servants and factory workers, who could not afford their own likenesses in life, saved scraps of hair or a torn corner of a photograph from someone else's discarded print. To hold any trace of the dead was to fight back against the great forgetting. This fear crept into language itself. Newspapers printed columns titled "Gone but Not Forgotten," while epitaphs pleaded, "Remember me." Books of poetry were filled with refrains of remembrance, each one a hymn against time's cruelty. Even fashion conspired with memory. Jet brooches engraved with initials, bracelets woven with hair, rings inscribed with dates. These were not adornments, but armor against erasure. Photographers understood this more than anyone. They saw it in the eyes of their clients, the desperate need not merely to see, but to be seen, even after life. One photographer in Liverpool confessed in his journal that every family he worked with asked the same question: "Will it last?" He told them yes, though he knew the glass would fade, the silver tarnish. But the truth was that photographs did last, longer than flowers, longer than handwriting, longer than the fragile flesh they captured. The Victorian photograph was less an image than a defiance, a refusal to allow the world to move on without acknowledgement. And yet, beneath their rituals and inventions, there was a deeper ache. The more they tried to preserve memory, the more they revealed its fragility. The albums that filled their parlors grew thick with faces that no one alive could name. Children inherited photographs of strangers' frozen ancestors whose stories had died with the previous generation. What began as remembrance slowly turned into mystery. Still, they kept the pictures, polished the frames, and whispered the words, "Never forgotten," even as the details slipped away. For what else could they do? Memory was the only immortality available to them, fragile, fading, and yet holy in its persistence. In their portraits, their tokens, their mourning rooms, the Victorians tried to cheat the silence that waits for everyone. And perhaps, in some small way, they succeeded. For even now, more than a century later, we still look at their faces and wonder who they were, and that, to them, would have been enough. He had stopped signing his work years ago. There was no pride left in it, no sense of accomplishment, only the growing heaviness of repetition. Each photograph was another confession, though no one would ever hear it. He kept a small journal in his coat pocket, where the pages had yellowed from chemical stains. At night, when the fumes of collodion and silver nitrate still clung to his hands, he would open it and write by candlelight. Today, another child. The light was poor. The mother fainted after the second exposure. He did not name them. He couldn't. To give them names would be to make them live again, and that was the one cruelty he could no longer bear. The faces blurred together, the pale infants, the young wives, the old fathers. In his memory, they shared the same expression, the quiet surrender of those who had crossed beyond pain. Only the living ones haunted him, the mothers who clutched his sleeve after the photograph was finished, whispering, "You've given her back to me." The fathers who pressed coins into his palm with trembling hands, unable to meet his eyes. He began the work out of necessity. Photography had been a trade like any other. His way of surviving after his apprenticeship at a printing shop ended. He had imagined portraits of newlyweds, proud merchants, soldiers in crisp uniforms, but the commissions that came were for death. They always paid in cash, and always in silence. Over the years, the silence grew unbearable. There were moments, late in the night, when he thought he could hear the plates murmuring. It was nonsense. Of course, the expansion of cooling glass, the creak of wood, but the sounds carried an uncanny rhythm, like faint breathing. Sometimes, he would walk to the drying rack and brush the edge of a plate with his thumb. The faces seemed to shift in the dim lamplight. The eyes he had painted, so many eyes, seemed to follow him. Once, after photographing a young mother and her stillborn child, he had lingered too long in the house. She had left the room to fetch water, and he found himself alone with the small, bundled figure. For reasons he could not explain, he spoke aloud. "You look at peace," he said softly. "Don't let me disturb you." The words felt wrong as soon as they left his mouth. That night, he could not sleep. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a footstep behind him. In his journal, he confessed things he would never dare tell another soul. How he sometimes saw his own reflection in the eyes of the dead. How he began to fear mirrors, for they too were made of glass and silver. How once, when he developed a plate, he found a second face beside the subject, his own, faint and watching. "I thought I was preserving them," he wrote in his final entry. "But I see now it is the other way around. They are the ones keeping me." When his apprentice arrived the next morning, the studio was quiet. The chemicals were neatly arranged, the lamp still burning low. On the work table lay a single glass plate, freshly developed. It showed the photographer himself, seated before his camera, eyes open but hollow, hands folded neatly in his lap. There was no sign of the shutter having been released. Yet somehow, the image was perfect. No one ever claimed his body. The studio was cleared, the equipment sold, the negatives destroyed. But years later, that single portrait would resurface in an antique shop, his final confession, captured forever in silver and shadow. Night was when grief became unbearable. By day, there were errands to keep the hands busy, letters to write, neighbors to receive, coffins to inspect, tea to pour for those who came with condolences they could not fully speak. But once the streets darkened and the lamps outside dimmed to amber, the house fell quiet, and the weight of loss returned like a familiar guest. That was when the candles were lit. Victorian homes glowed differently in mourning. The same flames that had once flickered cheerfully across wallpaper now trembled against mirrors veiled in black crepe. Shadows moved over portraits and curtains, turning the rooms into cathedrals of whispering light. Every house that had lost someone carried that peculiar scent. Beeswax, smoke, and flowers past their prime. The candles burned not for illumination but for company, their flames standing vigil where the living no longer could. In wealthier homes, entire nights were devoted to mourning rituals. The widow would sit in her parlor, dressed in bombazine and lace, her gloved hands folded around a locket or a rosary. Servants brought fresh candles hourly, replacing each one as it guttered low. She did not read or sew or speak. She simply watched the flames as though the dead might appear within them. At times, the flicker seemed to take shape a familiar profile, a soft breath of movement, and she would lean forward, heart pounding, before realizing it was only the draft through the curtains. For the poor, the custom was simpler but no less sacred. A single candle was placed at the bedside of the deceased, often in a reused glass jar or pewter cup. It was said the light kept evil spirits at bay, guiding the soul safely toward heaven. Families took turns keeping the flame alive through the night. Mothers, nodding half asleep in chairs, would wake at every sputter of the wick, terrified of letting the light die before dawn. To extinguish the flame too soon was an omen, a sign that the dead had not found peace. Photographers understood the importance of candlelight better than priests. They knew how it softened the sharpness of grief, how it carved the shadows of the room into reverence. Some even arranged small votives near their subjects during post-mortem sittings, claiming it brought warmth to the complexion. Others kept a candle burning in the studio overnight, not for ritual but for protection. It feels wrong to leave them in the dark. One photographer confessed in his diary in 1879, "I am afraid that if I do, they might remember me." When electricity finally began to spread through London's wealthier districts in the 1880 seconds, many widows resisted. They called the new bulbs soulless light, too harsh, too modern for the sanctity of mourning. Candles, they said, burned like hearts, small, warm, mortal. To replace them with cold wires and glass was to banish the dead completely. So the candles endured, their flames quivering through the years, long after mourning crepe had faded and portraits had yellowed on the walls. In every flicker, the Victorians found a fragile kind of faith, one that needed tending, one that threatened to go out at any moment. And perhaps that was why they loved it so dearly. The candle's light was not eternity, it was persistence. It burned, it trembled, it died, and then it was lit again. In that small, wavering glow, they saw themselves reflected, frail, faithful, and unready to let go. By the time the century reached its final decades, even children had learned what mourning looked like. They had grown up beneath portraits of the dead, watched their mothers pin black ribbons to their bonnets, and listened to the soft conversations that hovered between faith and fear. Childhood in Victorian Britain was not a garden of innocence, it was a rehearsal for grief. Death walked beside them from the cradle. The city itself was a teacher. In the poorer quarters, children saw funerals daily, small coffins carried through the fog, mourners trailing like shadows behind horse-drawn hearses. They memorized the toll of the church bell, knew which shops sold mourning crepe, and which offered cheap candles for vigil nights. Even their lullabies spoke of heaven, sleep, and reunion. To be a child in that age was to understand, without being told, that love was temporary, and that photographs were how people stayed. When a brother or sister died, the surviving children were expected to participate in the rituals. They held still for the photographer, learned to bow their heads during the parlor prayers, and sometimes placed a single flower on the small white coffin before it was carried away. Adults called it teaching them acceptance, but it left marks deeper than any sermon could reach. In the photographs that remain, the siblings' faces reveal that strange contradiction, solemn composure that hides confusion. The maturity of grief pressed too soon upon young hearts. One photograph from 881, shows three sisters seated on a sofa, the smallest lying across their laps. Her eyes are closed, her curls arranged perfectly. The eldest, perhaps 12, stares directly into the camera, her hand resting gently on the lifeless arm of the youngest. The other sister looks away, as though refusing to acknowledge the truth. The image is beautiful and unbearable. To the Victorians, it was a sign of devotion. To modern eyes, it is a portrait of innocence already lost. Death did not wait for adulthood to claim them. Epidemics of scarlet fever, cholera, and tuberculosis swept through schools and factories alike. Every child knew someone who had vanished overnight, and yet they played among the gravestones, turning churchyards into playgrounds because they had nowhere else to go. In some towns, so many young graves lined the hillside that children called them angel gardens. They chased each other between the stones, their laughter ringing through the fog, unbothered by what lay beneath. Writers of the era began to romanticize this intimacy with mortality. Poets filled magazines with verses about sleeping cherubs and flowers plucked too soon, softening the brutal reality into sentiment. But behind the language of purity and heaven lingered something darker, a quiet exhaustion. Even the most devout mothers began to question why heaven demanded so many of their little ones. By the end of the century, when medicine finally began to conquer the fevers that had stolen generations, the tone of mourning changed. The photographs of dead children grew rarer, the parlors less often turned into sanctuaries, but the shadow they left behind never truly lifted. It lived on in the faces of those who survived children grown old who had once held their siblings still for the camera, learning too young that love could be frozen, but never revived. For the Victorians, the death of a child was not just the loss of a future, it was the death of innocence itself. And yet, through their grief, they built a strange kind of immortality. The faces of their children, caught between breath and silence, still look back at us today, solemn, luminous, and unforgettably alive. Long before a mourner spoke a single word, her clothing announced her sorrow. To the Victorians, lace and fabric were not mere adornments, they were vocabulary, a visual grammar of grief understood by everyone, from duchesses to factory girls. Every fold, every thread, every shade of black had meaning. Mourning was not just an emotion, it was a discipline, one written in cloth. When death entered a home, the transformation began at once. Drawers were emptied, closets stripped of color, dresses were dyed or remade, white bonnets vanished beneath heavy crepe. The widow, newly consecrated by loss, became a living emblem of devotion. Her gown was to be dull, never lustrous, for shine was a sin of the frivolous. Her veil, thick, opaque, suffocating, was a curtain between herself and the world of the living. It was said that the first time a widow lifted her veil in public was as intimate as revealing her face to a lover. But even within this strict costume of grief, lace found a way to speak. Black lace whispered where words dared not tread. In the intricate pattern of threads, women encoded their mourning, some delicate, others bold, each telling a private story. A widow who wished to show eternal fidelity might wear Chantilly lace, with its dark floral motifs symbolizing undying love. Another, ready to rejoin society but unwilling to admit it, might choose a lighter weave with hints of grey, the textile equivalent of a sigh. Lace allowed emotion to slip through the iron cage of etiquette. For the poor, lace was aspiration. They could not afford fine mourning crepe, but they could sew black trim along their sleeves, or drape the coffin in fabric borrowed from a wealthier neighbor. Seamstresses wept quietly as they stitched ribbons for the funerals of children they had once mended play clothes for. Whole industries flourished in the wake of death, lace makers, dyers, milliners, all serving a nation of mourners. Factories in Nottingham and Calais ran day and night to meet the demand for what one writer called the country's uniform of despair. Mourning etiquette was relentless. The first year for a widow was deep mourning, demanding only matte fabrics and no adornment. The second allowed for half mourning. Grey, lilac, or mauve could return cautiously to the wardrobe. Lace became softer then, more transparent, as though acknowledging that grief itself had begun to thin. Society watched these transitions closely. A woman who wore color too soon risked whispers of indecency. A woman who stayed in black too long was pitied, or worse, suspected of enjoying the drama of her loss. And yet, within those constraints, lace became an art of rebellion. Some women used its patterns to communicate the very things mourning tried to suppress. In France, widows wove their initials into the hems of veils, a secret message of identity surviving beneath the weight of conformity. In London, dressmakers began embedding tiny silver threads into the lace edges of sleeves, calling it the light within mourning. The Queen herself, eternally clad in black after Prince Albert's death, softened her severity with layers of lace, as though even she needed something delicate to remind her she was still alive. When the century drew to its close and mourning fashions finally loosened, most people blamed progress, or exhaustion, or changing morals. But perhaps it was lace that changed them. Those fragile webs of thread had taught an entire generation how to express emotion without breaking silence, how to speak love through texture and shadow. Today, when we see a length of Victorian lace in a museum, dark, intricate, impossibly fine, we see not just craft but language. Every loop and flourish still murmurs the same words those women once carried on their sleeves. I remember, I endure, I remain. By the late Victorian era, grief had become an exhibition. Memory, once private and sacred, now lived behind glass. In drawing rooms, city galleries, and curiosity cabinets across Britain, people began to collect sorrow, curating death the way others collected coins or seashells. These collections were not of relics alone, but of remembrance itself. Each photograph, locket, and curl of hair was an artifact of love, labeled and arranged in a quiet defiance of time. Every home held its own museum. In the corner of the parlor, atop the piano or under a glass dome, sat the displays of loss, framed photographs of the departed, dried bouquets from funerals, locks of hair braided into wreaths. The Victorians called them memory pieces. Some were delicate works of art, flowers shaped from the hair of several generations, arranged in symmetrical patterns that glowed honey brown in the light. Others were simple, a small daguerreotype, slightly tarnished, placed beside a Bible open to Psalm 23. Visitors were expected to pause before them, bowing heads slightly as one might before an altar. In wealthier homes, these relics expanded into entire rooms. Cabinets lined with mourning jewelry, shelves filled with glass negatives, albums stacked thick with faces of the dead. Each item was annotated with careful handwriting. Mother, 1863. Edmund, 1871. Taken 2 days before the fever. These galleries of grief were not melancholy to the Victorians, they were comforting, proof that the past had not vanished, merely changed its form. Memory had been made visible. Museums and public institutions soon followed suit. The rise of anthropology and natural history blurred the line between scientific collection and human commemoration. Death photographs were displayed as cultural curiosities. Mourning jewelry was studied as fashion. In 1884, a London exhibition titled Memorial Art of the Century presented post-mortem portraits beside marble busts and religious sculpture. Critics described it as a study in tenderness, though some viewers fainted upon entering. One reviewer wrote, "It is as though we have found a way to embalm the soul itself." There was irony in the obsession. The same empire that industrialized progress could not bear to let go of its dead. The Victorians, who built railways across continents and wires across oceans, also built temples to memory inside their homes. Their cabinets of mourning were filled with contradictions, hope and despair, science and superstition, the mechanical precision of photography paired with the trembling faith of the heart. Even those who mocked the practice could not fully resist it. A doctor who lectured against the morbid sentimentality of relics kept his wife's locket in his coat pocket until he died. A historian who dismissed mourning photography as emotional excess was later discovered to have preserved his son's shoes in a locked drawer for 40 years. When electric light began to replace candlelight, the old glass domes gleamed differently. The faces beneath them, once luminous in the flicker of flame, became pale, ghost-like under the new brilliance. Slowly, the museums of loss began to close. Families sold their cabinets, their albums, their jewelry. Grief, like everything else, was being modernized. And yet, in dusty attics and antique shops, these artifacts endure. A wreath woven from human hair, a photograph of a sleeping child, her curls arranged like a crown, a note in spidery handwriting. Do not discard, her touch remains here. They are fragments of an age that tried, with all its ingenuity and sentiment, to outwit oblivion. The Victorians could not conquer death, but in their museums of loss, they found a way to keep it beautiful. No one mourned more publicly or more powerfully than Queen Victoria. When Prince Albert died in the winter of 1861, she withdrew from the world, retreating into a solitude that would last 40 years. Her sorrow became national doctrine, her black dresses a second flag over Britain. Through her, mourning transformed from private grief into an empire-wide performance of fidelity. The Queen's loss was no longer personal, it was cultural, and through her shadow, every household in Britain learned how to grieve. At first, courtiers assumed her seclusion would pass. They whispered that the Queen would return to her duties once her shock had softened, once the funeral flowers faded. But days became months, and months became years. She dismissed most of her staff, shuttered her drawing rooms, and ordered that Albert's chambers remain exactly as he had left them, his clothes laid out each morning, his water pitcher refilled nightly. She spoke to his portrait at breakfast, signed her letters from the widow of Windsor, and referred to him as if he were simply away on business. Even her children were permitted to speak of him only in the present tense. The public, at first sympathetic, soon became obsessed. Newspapers reported her attire, counting the months she remained in deep mourning. Shopkeepers began to advertise mourning silks of the royal shade. Society ladies followed her example with fervor, wearing crepe and jet long after etiquette required. The Queen's sorrow became fashion, and her loneliness became law. Mourning had always existed as ritual. Victoria made it spectacle. Photographers understood her better than her ministers did. When she allowed herself to be captured again on camera, veiled, pale, eyes downcast, the image became a symbol of devotion so absolute it bordered on sanctity. Prints of the Mourning Queen were sold throughout the empire. In them, Victoria seemed less a woman than a relic herself, part mother, part widow, part marble monument. Across parlors and schoolrooms, her veiled likeness hung beside family photographs, as if her grief somehow sanctified everyone else's. What began as one woman's heartbreak spread like weather. Her servants, out of loyalty, adopted mourning attire that lasted decades. Entire colonies mirrored her customs. In India, British officials held memorial services for Albert for years after his death, lighting candles and posing for photographs beside his framed portrait. The Queen's grief crossed oceans. It colonized emotion itself. But as the years passed, some began to question her devotion. Critics called it pathological mourning. Doctors speculated that prolonged grief had become a form of illness. Yet the public continued to adore her precisely because of it. In an age when death claimed everyone's home, the Queen's refusal to recover made her their mirror. She was the mother who could not stop remembering the nation's living monument to loss. When she finally died in 1901, they found in her coffin two objects clasped in her hands, a lock of Prince Albert's hair and a photograph of John Brown, the Scottish servant who had remained her closest companion after Albert's death. Even at the end, she carried her ghosts with her. Her reign had redrawn the map of mourning. The Victorians had always believed in remembrance, but under her shadow, it became identity. She taught them that to grieve was to love, and to love was to preserve. And long after her empire dissolved, Her shadow remained in every widow who kept a portrait by her bed, in every photograph of the dead framed beneath lace, and in every flickering candle that refused to be extinguished. By the last quarter of the 19th century, Britain's mourning customs had ceased to belong only to Britain. They had become an export, an empire of grief, carried across oceans in steamships and missionaries' trunks, in etiquette manuals and illustrated catalogues. Wherever the Union Jack flew, black crape followed. Death became one more possession of empire, codified in the same ledgers that tallied tea, textiles, and souls. In India, British colonists built cemeteries that mirrored those of Surrey and Kent. Marble angels stood sentinel over foreign soil, their wings streaked by monsoon rain. The wives of officers ordered mourning gowns from London by sea, each one tailored to the precise stage of bereavement: deep mourning, half mourning, then second mourning, so that not even the tropics could loosen the rules of grief. Their native servants washed the black bombazine, pressed the veils, and learned the strange arithmetic of sorrow according to English fashion. 6 months for a parent, one was heard to recite, 2 years for a husband, forever for a queen. In Africa, missionaries carried the gospel and the grammar of mourning together. Converts were taught not only how to pray, but how to bury properly, how to dress in black, how to write condolence letters, how to speak of the dead with restraint instead of wailing. In the Caribbean, freedmen who had once been denied the right to grieve openly now found themselves adopting Victorian rituals as symbols of dignity: printed death notices, mourning jewelry, photographs mailed to relatives across the sea. Grief, like empire, became a performance of civilization. The colonies returned the favor in their own ways. From India came fabrics dyed with deeper, more enduring blacks than any English dye could manage. From the Pacific came shell and pearl for mourning ornaments. Colonial photographers, many trained by itinerant Britons, set up studios that reproduced the same soft light and solemn poses seen in London's Pall Mall. In Calcutta, one photographer even advertised English-style memorial portraiture for Christian and native families alike, a sign of both mimicry and quiet subversion. Yet beneath the empire's polished rituals, a contradiction festered. The same empire that wept so elegantly for its dead inflicted death casually upon others. Newspapers that printed verses for fallen soldiers in India did not record the Indian families who had perished beside them. The Queen's shadow stretched over continents, but her people's empathy stopped at the edges of their own mourning frames. Still, for those who served abroad, the rituals were a tether to home. Soldiers carried small photographs of wives and children inside their breast pockets. Missionaries wrote black-edged letters from distant jungles. Widows in Hong Kong held seances to summon husbands lost to malaria or mutiny. The empire's heart beat to the rhythm of loss as much as conquest. When telegraph cables finally linked Britain to its farthest colonies, the first messages of death travelled faster than ever before. Albert Edward fallen ill, son perished at sea, mother gone to glory. Grief had become instantaneous, global, electric. The empire had succeeded in shrinking the world, but it had also shrunk the distance between the living and the dead. By the century's end, the empire of mourning was complete. From London to Lahore, the rituals of remembrance bound millions together in a shared choreography of sorrow: black fabric, silver frames, candles, and portraits. These were the emblems of unity in an empire that could not agree on anything else. And though the borders would one day dissolve, the habit endured, that peculiar Victorian conviction that the only way to master death was to make it beautiful, to polish it, to export it, and to teach the world how to weep properly. The century turned, and with it, something in the light itself began to change. Photographers spoke of it as though the sun had grown indifferent, its warmth dulled, its patience shortened. It was not the sun, of course, but the world. The long, ritualized stillness of Victorian grief was slipping away, replaced by the quickness of the modern age. The same invention that had once promised immortality now threatened to make memory ordinary. By the 1,890 seconds, Cameras were no longer the heavy brass contraptions that had stood like altars in the mourning parlor. George Eastman's Kodak had put a camera into the hands of anyone with a few shillings to spare. The process required no darkroom, no collodion fumes, no ceremony. You pressed a button, and the company did the rest. Death, once treated with reverent preparation, could now be captured with the same ease as a Sunday picnic. The result was progress, but it felt, to many, like desecration. Photographers who had built their livelihoods upon sorrow found their clientele dwindling. The families who once paid dearly for post-mortem portraits were now content with snapshots taken while their loved ones still lived. Albums filled with smiling faces, blurred by laughter and motion, replaced the solemn, perfect stillness of the old plates. The old masters of mourning photography, men who had once handled grief as carefully as glass, closed their studios one by one. Some sold their lenses to younger men chasing novelty. Others simply locked their doors and left their darkrooms to dust. In the cities, where electric light now gleamed from every window, candlelit vigils seemed quaint, a relic of an age too sentimental for modern taste. The new century worshipped energy, not stillness. Death, that great stillness, was hidden away, moved from parlors to hospitals, from homes to institutions. The undertaker replaced the priest, the mortuary replaced the parlor. The Victorians had stared death in the face, dressed it, photographed it, even adorned it with flowers. Their children turned away, but those who had lived through the earlier era, the widows in their worn black lace, the aging photographers, the mothers who still kept portraits of infants gone 40 years, felt the shift as betrayal. The light no longer lingers, one elderly photographer wrote in his journal in 1902. It used to wait with us, as if listening. Now it vanishes before the plate cools. The new dry plates and roll films no longer shimmered with the strange, ghostly halos that once made the old photographs seem alive. Chemistry had improved. Mystery had been removed. The new images were sharper, colder, without the tremor of spirit that haunted the collodion age. The Victorians had believed the photograph could hold a trace of the soul. The Edwardians, efficient and forward-looking, preferred it to hold the truth and nothing else. Yet, as the old photographers retired and their glass plates were sold or discarded, something else began to fade. The quiet reverence that had once surrounded the act of remembrance. The photographs that survived were stripped of their stories. Names were lost, inscriptions rubbed away. The faces remained, but their meaning dimmed, like light receding through dust. In a small shop off Whitechapel Road, one such photograph hung for sale. An infant wrapped in lace, eyes closed, a faint smile ghosting her lips. No one knew who she was, or that she had died before the century turned. She was priced at 6pence, and so the light that had once immortalized grief now flickered weakly in second-hand shops, scattered through drawers and boxes. The art that had once preserved eternity had become an artifact of forgetfulness. The old photographers had been right about one thing. The light itself would fade, but not before it left its imprint, fragile, beautiful, and mortal on glass that still glowed faintly when touched by morning sun. The invention that once promised eternity had finally been made small enough to fit in a hand. By the first years of the 20th century, death had lost its stage. The Kodak camera, light and unassuming, had carried memory out of the studio and into the street. No longer did families wait for the photographer to arrive with tripods and silvered plates. Now they carried their own magic lanterns, their own miniature factories of remembrance. And with that, mourning, once solemn, deliberate, almost holy, became casual, even accidental. The snapshot, as it was called, was not meant for death. It was meant for life. Seaside holidays, picnics, parades, birthdays. But the living carried the same logic of preservation into every click of the shutter. They no longer needed to wait for loss to sanctify memory. The snapshot preempted grief. Every smiling face, every garden, every pet or grandchild framed in the lens was a quiet insurance against the inevitable. Death was still coming, but now it would have to fight its way through rolls of film. The tone of photography changed. The earlier generations had sat for the camera as one might for confession. They had believed the moment eternal, serious, transformative. Now people laughed into the lens, their heads tilted mid-motion, their clothes rumpled. The photograph no longer whispered of eternity, it shouted of immediacy. Memory had been democratized and diluted. Old photographers, those who had once captured the silence of grief, watched the new world with quiet resentment. Their art had been ritual. Their clients had approached them with reverence. Now the work of a lifetime could be replaced by a boy on the street snapping a penny portrait. The darkroom, once a sanctum of shadow and chemistry, had become an afterthought. They said the new photographs smelled of nothing, no ether, no silver nitrate, no solemnity, only speed. But even as mourning lost its grandeur, a subtler sorrow crept into the new images. In the albums of middle-class families, those leather-bound volumes filled with everyday snapshots, time itself became visible. One page showed a smiling husband in a bowler hat, the next his widow, thin and pale, with a child on her lap. The camera that had once been used to deny death now recorded its passage with merciless clarity. The Victorians had believed that photographs could preserve life. The Edwardians learned that photographs could also measure how quickly it disappeared. For women, especially, the snapshot became a new kind of power. They carried pocket cameras on trains and holidays, photographing their children, their homes, their gardens. They no longer needed the permission of a studio or the expertise of a craftsman. In a small, quiet rebellion, they became the archivists of their own lives. Grief, when it came, was no longer framed beneath velvet curtains but stored in boxes, hidden in drawers, revisited in secret. And yet, something of the old reverence remained. In the pause before each shutter release, there was still that tiny stillness the breath held, the acknowledgement that this moment, once gone, would never return. The Victorians had used photography to fight against forgetting. Their descendants used it to keep pace with change. But in the end, the desire was the same, to catch time before it slipped away. As the 20th century dawned, death was no longer photographed. Life was. Yet behind every cheerful snapshot, every blurred smile, the shadow of the old art lingered. For though the mourning parlor had closed its doors, the instinct that built it, the refusal to let love fade entirely, still lived in the flick of every shutter, echoing like the faint pulse of light that first taught the dead to look back. In the years after the Mourning studios closed, their glass plates began to wander. They were too heavy to keep, too fragile to store, too painful to throw away. Some photographers, weary of the weight of memory, sold their collections to scrap dealers who scraped the silver from their surfaces for pennies. Others, sentimental or superstitious, hid them in attics and basements, behind walls, beneath floorboards. They told themselves they would be reclaimed someday, but time, like dust, buried them instead. For decades the negatives slept. Thousands of them, faces that had once been prayed over, kissed, and framed, lay stacked in wooden boxes and forgotten trunks. The labels faded, the ink dissolved into anonymity, the glass itself clouded with mold, the silver emulsions cracked and peeled like aging skin. In damp corners, spiders spun their own fine webs across the images, binding the living memory of the dead in silk. And yet, some endured. Every so often, a builder tearing down an old London shop would find a crate of glass plates tucked behind a false wall. The discovery always began the same way. A box half rotted, a faint glimmer of glass, the outline of faces when held to the light. At first, they would seem ghostly eyes and mouths barely discernible through the grime, but once cleaned, they revealed astonishing detail. A lock of hair pinned perfectly, a doll clutched to a chest, a mother's hand resting over a child's. These were not ghosts. They were the fragments of an age that had tried to trap eternity in chemistry. Museums began to take notice. In the 1,930 seconds, archivists in Manchester uncovered an entire collection belonging to a long-dead photographer named Edmund Halsey. nearly 2,000 plates, each labeled with dates, each a portrait of grief. When the first was printed, curators fell silent. The image was of a little boy seated upright, head slightly tilted, one eye faintly brighter than the other. A smudge of motion, his mother's hand, blurred by grief, lingered beside him. "It feels like he's still breathing," one of them murmured. They decided to preserve the whole collection, calling it the Halsey Plates of Memory. But for every set saved, hundreds more were lost. The glass was too delicate, the world too indifferent. When the wars came, scavengers raided empty buildings, melting the silver from old negatives to make mirrors, scraping away faces for the sake of reflection. In those years, whole generations of mourning vanished, not through malice, but through need. It is said that in the villages of Yorkshire and Dorset, farmers still find fragments of those plates beneath the soil when ploughing fields. Hold them to the sun, and you can see faint outlines, half a smile, the suggestion of an eye, a shadow of lace. The images fade the moment they touch air, as though embarrassed to be seen again. In a way, the forgetting completed what the Victorians had started. Their dream had been to stop time. Their failure ensured its beauty. The negatives, broken and buried, became relics not only of the people they depicted, but of the longing that created them. Every shard of glass, every half-visible face, is a testament to that impossible wish, that love could resist oblivion. And perhaps it has, for even now, when one of those forgotten plates is lifted to the light, it glows, not brightly, just enough to remind whoever finds it that memory, like silver, tarnishes but never truly dies. In the heart of London, down a narrow alley where the gas lamps sputtered and leaned, there existed a basement that smelled of dust, mold, and old wood. It belonged to a man who collected what others could not or would not. He was a silent figure in a world that had forgotten the art of mourning photography, yet his basement was a cathedral of grief. Stacked from floor to ceiling were boxes of glass plates, albums bound in cracked leather, and frames whose silvered faces gleamed faintly even in the dim light. The collector did not advertise. He had no shop front, no advertisement in the local paper. Those who found their way to his door came by reputation alone, whispered from antiquarian to antiquarian. If you wish to see the old griefs, the true faces of loss, go to the man in the alley. Many left shaken, holding nothing but a single photograph pressed into their hands like a relic. Some came back repeatedly, unable to stop themselves from returning to the silent audience of the dead. The basement was crowded and labyrinthine. Boxes were stacked in aisles narrow enough to brush the shelves on either side, the weight of glass pressing in from all directions. The air was damp, carrying the faint smell of ether that had seeped from the photographs over decades. When he lifted a plate from a box, the collector handled it with the utmost care, fingers wrapped in thin cotton gloves, his eyes narrowing to catch every detail of a face frozen in eternity. One misstep could chip the glass, erase the expression, destroy the memory. Among the treasures were children, posed in lifelike repose with dolls or favorite toys arranged across their laps. Mothers' hands rested gently on shoulders, fathers' gloved hands held up with solemn gravity. Each photograph was an encapsulated moment, a fragment of life and death fused through chemistry and devotion. The collector understood their power. It was not merely their beauty, but their ability to make the living feel that the dead were still present, still watching, still remembered. Occasionally, he would hold a plate up to the lamplight, and the image seemed to breathe. Shadows shifted subtly on the glass, giving the illusion of movement, a hand twitching, an eyelid flickering, a curl of hair catching the light as though a breeze had passed through it. He never claimed it was supernatural, though he believed it. The Victorians had intended their art to preserve love. Perhaps some fragment of that love lingered still, in the silver, in the dust, in the quiet air of the basement. The collector also kept the negatives, the forgotten counterparts to the glossy images above. These plates were fragile beyond belief, yet they contained the purest memory of each child, each mother, each solemn pose. Sometimes he would develop one on a small darkroom tray, watching it appear slowly in the chemical bath. When the image emerged, he often found himself whispering the name of the child aloud, though the name was long forgotten by the world outside. Visitors to the basement often remarked on the silence. It was not merely the absence of conversation, but something more profound. The quiet of hundreds of lives paused, an ache suspended in the air. One might come expecting to see only images, but left feeling that the room itself remembered the dead, their tears, their whispered names, their fleeting smiles, all folded into silver and glass. And when he closed the door at night, leaving the candles guttering against the damp stone walls, the collector walked through the empty city with the sensation that he was not alone. Every plate, every photograph, every shadowed frame seemed to follow him silently, a reminder that memory, even when stored in a basement, can weigh as heavily as life itself. It was said that the gallery in Bloomsbury was haunted not by poltergeists or phantoms of the imagination, but by the presence of those who had once posed for eternity. The walls were lined with photographs of children, mothers, and fathers, each captured in that strange liminal moment between life and death. Candlelight flickered over silvered faces, creating shadows that seemed to move when no one was looking. Visitors whispered of eyes that followed them, of faint smiles that appeared only at the edge of vision, as though the subjects themselves were aware of being observed. The gallery's curator was a meticulous man, obsessive in his devotion to the preservation of these relics. He understood that these were more than photographs, they were fragments of lives, proof of a culture that refused to forget. He dusted each frame with gloves, arranged them according to date, and catalogued them with the precision of a librarian and the reverence of a priest. But even he admitted, in quiet moments, that sometimes the photographs seemed to breathe. Visitors came from all corners of the empire. Some were scholars of Victorian customs, curious about the rituals of death. Others were artists, seeking inspiration in the solemnity and beauty of frozen grief. They moved slowly, reverently, through the rooms, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of shadow and light. Each photograph was lit so that the subject appeared almost alive, the faint halo of exposure imbuing faces with a softness that could only have been imagined by those who had never held a deceased child in their arms. Yet the gallery was not without its critics. Skeptics called it macabre, claiming that it fetishized death, that it turned mourning into spectacle. But those who understood the Victorians knew better. The photographs were not intended to entertain. They were intended to preserve, to honor, to bear witness. Each one told a story of love and loss, of hands held too briefly, of eyes that had never opened to see the world beyond their own fleeting existence. Some visitors, especially the elderly who had lived through the age of post-mortem photography, would pause before particular frames and weep silently. They remembered the rituals, the long hours of preparation, the painstaking attention to detail. They recalled the mother's hands resting over the bodies of their children, the father's rigid composure, the quiet hush that fell over a household while the shutter clicked. In those moments, the gallery was not merely a museum, it was a home, a church, a parlor frozen in time. And sometimes, when the gallery was empty and the candlelight flickered low, the shadows seemed to stir. The slightest movement across a photograph, a curl of hair, a blink, a faint shift in expression would make the visitor shiver, as if the dead were aware of their observation. Scholars dismissed it as trickery of the eye. The curator preferred to call it memory, the echo of love preserved in silver and glass. By the time the lights were extinguished for the night, the gallery became a quiet cathedral of absence. Every photograph watched, every frame waited, and the weight of those countless lives pressed gently on the stone floors. In that silence, one understood what the Victorians had always known. Memory could be preserved, even in death, but it required vigilance, devotion, and most of all willingness to see the dead not as departed, but as present, enduring, and watching. Even decades after the last shutter had clicked in the quiet parlor, some faces refused to vanish. They lingered in the albums, in the drawers of forgotten attics, in the memory of those who had once held the photographs to their hearts. The Victorians had believed that grief could be captured, that silver and glass could hold life long after it had left the body, and for some images their faith was not misplaced. The faces would not fade. In a small village outside Manchester, an elderly widow opened a leather-bound album, its pages warped with age. She turned slowly, touching each photograph with trembling fingers. The children were frozen mid-laugh, the mother's hands still poised over the bodies of their little ones. The inked notes on the backs of the plates were nearly illegible now. Names, dates, prayers, and promises that time could never erase. For a moment, she felt their presence as acutely as she had the day they were placed before the camera. Her breath caught, and she whispered their names aloud, as though speaking might summon them from the silver. These images had a peculiar way of resisting decay. Unlike paintings that faded under sunlight, or paper that yellowed with age, the silvered plates seemed to preserve not only likeness, but something deeper: the echo of a moment, the tremor of hands, the unspoken dialogue between mother and child. Photographs that had survived floods, fire, and damp basements revealed the same haunting clarity as the day they were developed. The children's eyes, painted open or carefully adjusted, still seemed to hold a spark of life. Collectors understood this better than most. They sought out the glass plates not merely for curiosity, but for their ability to haunt. In private collections, visitors would trace their fingers along the images, startled by the weight of emotion pressed into the emulsion. Scholars studied them, historians catalogued them, but all agreed on one thing: these were more than photographs. They were vessels of memory, holding what flesh could not, preserving what the world had long since forgotten. Even modern scientists were captivated. In a laboratory, a negative recovered from a London attic revealed the precise texture of a child's skin, the faint blush applied by the mother to mimic life, the delicate curl of a single eyelash. The more they examined it, the more apparent it became. The photograph had not merely captured likeness, it had preserved intention, care, and devotion. The Victorians, in their obsession with memory, had inadvertently created a form of immortality, and yet there was a cost. Those who spent too long with these images often reported unease, a sensation that the children were watching, waiting for recognition. Some collectors refused to hang them on walls, fearing that their subjects might intrude upon the living. Others, in the privacy of their studies, placed the images beside lamps or mirrors, letting the faint flicker of candlelight animate the still faces. In these moments, the boundary between life and death blurred, and the old rituals of grief seemed almost alive. Across attics, basements, and galleries, the same truth persisted. The faces would not fade. Locked in silver and glass, they endured through generations, haunting, comforting, and demanding remembrance. The Victorians had sought to resist the impermanence of life, and in that pursuit they had succeeded. Their dead children remained, unblinking and eternal, whispering a quiet truth to anyone willing to look. Memory, once captured, is never truly lost. When we gaze upon the photographs left behind by the Victorians, we see more than faces frozen in silver. We see ourselves reflected back, and the reflection is unsettling. The impulse that drove them to preserve, to hold, to deny the finality of death is not gone. It has merely transformed. Our cameras are smaller, faster, and everywhere. Our grief is broadcast on screens rather than printed on thick, black-edged paper. Yet the desire is the same: to stop time, to hold our loved ones in a state of perpetual presence, to deny oblivion. Social media has become the modern parlor, a gallery where memory and mourning intersect. Parents post images of children who will not live to adulthood. Friends share snapshots of those who have passed, marking anniversaries and birthdays in comments and hashtags. The impulse is identical to the Victorian one: to insist that those who have gone remain, in some sense, visible, tangible, acknowledged. In our likes and shares, we replicate the careful attention the Victorians once gave to arranging a child's curls, positioning a mother's hand, painting faint traces of life onto eyelids. The ephemeral nature of digital images, however, adds a new anxiety. Unlike glass plates, which could survive decades if handled properly, our photographs are fleeting. Hard drives fail, accounts are hacked, clouds collapse under the weight of time. The permanence that Victorians sought through chemistry now feels impossible. Yet the drive to capture life before it vanishes is more urgent than ever. We take thousands of images, yet each one is a negotiation with mortality, a prayer against the forgetting that shadows every life. Even in funerals and memorials, the rituals echo the old world. Candles are lit, framed photographs displayed, screens projected with moving images, while mourners pause in silence. The desire to hold attention, to compel memory, persists, just as it did in the dimly lit parlors, where black-clad mothers waited for the shutter to click. We may no longer need velvet curtains or collodion, but the psychology of loss remains unchanged. Grief still demands witness, still insists that the dead be seen, acknowledged, and preserved. And the uncanny lingers too. Just as Victorians swore their children seemed to move beneath the lens, people today notice peculiar shadows, ghostly double images, or reflections in screens and glass. Some dismiss it as trickery, others as coincidence, but the effect is the same. The dead appear to look back at us, demanding recognition. In a way, the silver plates were merely the first medium. The principle, the need to memorialize, to hold life just beyond reach, has migrated seamlessly into the digital age. Looking at these old photographs now, we see both the past and the present. We see the obsessive devotion, the tender terror, and the ingenuity of a people who refuse to let go. And we see our own reflection in the thousands of images we take, the memorials we post, the anniversaries we mark online. The Victorians taught us that grief could be structured, performed, and preserved. We have inherited the lesson and the burden. For every photograph we take, every memory we attempt to fix, whispers the same truth they knew. Love, once captured, is never entirely gone, and forgetting is never complete. In the end, their silent, glassed faces still speak to us across the centuries. And in that mirror, we recognize ourselves not only in the way we grieve, but in our desperate, universal desire to hold time still, if only for a moment, against the relentless march of mortality. It is in the quietest hours, when the house is dark and the world has gone to sleep, that the photograph seems to come alive. The candle guttered low in the Victorian parlor, and in its trembling light, the child's face appeared to stir, eyes glinting with the faintest trace of movement. Perhaps it was the flicker of the flame, or the shadows on the wall, or the mind's longing to see what had already gone. Yet, for those who had lived through the age of post-mortem photography, the sensation was unmistakable. The photograph still breathed. For decades, families had relied on these images to carry the memory of their lost children. The mother who sat beside her child for the hour-long exposure, the father who adjusted the child's limbs on the chair, the photographer who whispered apologies under his breath. They all understood the fragile power of the moment, captured in silver and glass. Each photograph was a small act of defiance against the inevitability of decay, a protest against the slow erasure of love and life. The faces, frozen yet radiant, held their presence as firmly as the living ever could. The room itself seemed to remember them. Mirrors, draped in black, reflected the faint glow of candlelight across the photographs, creating a halo around each small figure. The walls, lined with velvet and papered with quiet respect, seemed to absorb and echo the lives that had passed. To enter such a parlor was to step into a liminal space, where time had no dominion and sorrow was tangible, pressing softly against the skin. Even the air smelled of memory, wax, dust, dried flowers, and the subtle metallic tang of silvered glass. Photographers understood this more keenly than most. They knew that their craft was not merely mechanical, not simply chemical, it was spiritual. To arrange a body so that it appeared at peace, to manipulate light and shadow, to coax the lifeless into a semblance of consciousness, this was a skill that required both precision and reverence. The photographs they produced were not pictures in the ordinary sense. They were vessels of endurance. In every exposure, a fragment of hope, of love, and of grief was embedded, and it lingered indefinitely. Even after the Victorian age ended, when cameras became smaller, film faster, and photographs commonplace, the principle remained. The photograph still breathes because it carries more than light. It carries intention, devotion, and memory. A child's face, once arranged and captured, continues to speak to those who see it. A mother's hand pressed over a shoulder, a doll cradled in tiny fingers, to the faint brush of rouge on the cheeks. All of these details preserve not just likeness, but life itself, at least in perception. Modern viewers may dismiss these images as macabre, as relics of a sentimental past, but the truth is subtle and enduring. The photographs were designed to do one thing: to resist forgetting. They succeeded. Even now, when one holds a surviving glass plate to the light, there is the unmistakable impression of breath, the whisper of presence, the echo of a soul unwilling to depart entirely. And so, the photograph continues its quiet vigil, as it has for more than a century. It waits in dusty attics, in private collections, in museums, and in memory. It preserves not only what once was, but what still can be felt: the ache of loss, the persistence of love, and the impossibility of letting go. For the Victorians, it was a defiance. For us, it is a reminder: even in death, memory endures. The photograph still breathes.